but I feel like I'm underperforming in some way for the show. I have a habit of like overcompensating a little bit. So I haven't made a horror story here.
Okay.
I've kind of made 5 horror stories.
In 2017, Universal Studios announced the birth of a new shared universe of monster movies, bringing their classic horror icons into the contemporary franchise film landscape. But after the critical and financial failure of its first installment, the project was indefinitely abandoned. Now, in 2022, the powers that be have called upon one pulp horror devotee and one snarky film critic to unearth the concept. I'm Dylan Roth.
And I'm Dalton DeShane.
Are you afraid of the dark universe?
Welcome back to Are You Afraid of the Dark Universe, the podcast where we attempt to resurrect Universal Studios' failed cinematic universe of monster movies, one pitch at a time. I'm one of your hosts, Dylan Roth.
I'm 2 of your hosts, Dalton DeShane.
Whoa!
Because I'm non-binary. It's
That's
plural.
how it works. Yeah. And together we have been building out the Dark Universe into an ongoing narrative to rival the MCU. We're nearing the end of phase 2 of our Dark Universe. This is our 21st episode.
Oh my God.
And on today's episode, I will be pitching Dalton my latest, air quotes, masterpiece, Dracula Lives.
This is, our final film before our Age of Ultron, before our second big crossover movie.
Here we are. Dracula is, of course, perhaps the most iconic Universal monster, and this is his first solo film in our universe. We waited all this time. I have written a brick of a book for this.
Look at how long this episode is. We don't know yet, but
we don't know.
Betting it's a barn burner.
I regret that I have written something this long on a night where we have to record another episode after this.
Right after this, yes. I've had a lot of Coke, Coca-Cola, not
yes,
the other kind.
The Coca-Cola.
I'm sober. But so we should get right into some of the nitty-gritty then, because we got a lot to get to.
Yeah,
and
let's not
as you
dawdle.
said, this is our Dracula movie, so we put out the call for fan expectations, and we have a lot of them.
Oh, no pressure.
This was definitely the most responses we've ever gotten to the fan expectations prompt on social media. And so I want to go through, I can't go through all of them. We had so many responses, so I'm sorry if you're left out.
And thank you so much for your enthusiasm.
Yes, thank you for your enthusiasm. And then, of course, I have to get to my expectations for this film because I do have some, and we'll talk about that. Put the pressure on right before we start.
Whee!
So I tried to grab a few different comments that kind of fall under some themes that were recurring. Number one, let's talk about people who want some iconic vampire tropes. Leo on Twitter says they want at least one reference to the 1931 Spanish version, which we talked about on the Discord.
I do love the Spanish version.
The Spanish version of Dracula is excellent. If people haven't seen it, it was filmed on the same sets as the Bela Lugosi Dracula, but at night with Spanish actors so they could sell the film in Spanish-speaking countries. A lot of people think it's better than the Bela
I prefer
Lugosi.
it. I watched them back to back last month or in May preparing for this. Yeah. And I like this one better.
Sam on Twitter wants some armadillos as a reference to in the 1931 Bela Lugosi Dracula, there are armadillos in Dracula's castle for some reason, because I think they were looking for exotic animals. And
sorry, no armadillos in this draft.
All right, Sam, I am so sorry. And Samantha on our Discord wants nods to iconic vampire tropes, either as in-setting misconceptions or just a thing that happens, and also some brutal fucking murders.
Okay, I think I've got you covered on those.
That's good. That's good to hear. Now let's get into some of the plot things that people want. So should we catch people up on where Dracula is in our universe before we get into this part?
In case anybody is new to the show or just needs their memory refreshed, Dracula has made a couple of appearances in our universe prior to this, most notably in the Dark Legion House of Dracula, our sort of first Avengers movie.
Mm-hmm.
In that film, Dracula is trying to become the new god of death, basically, and using these artifacts to take the power of Osiris and just Osiris, right?
I think it was just Osiris, yeah.
Take the power of the Egyptian god Osiris.
We know the plot of the movie we wrote,
yes,
vaguely.
It's almost a year ago, Dalton. Dracula tries to take the power of Osiris and give himself control over life and death for everybody on Earth. And it is, the plan backfires thanks to the intervention of the Dark Legion.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up being punished for his hubris by being transformed back into a human.
Yes.
And when this
basically,
happens,
he's given his life back by Tom Cruise, Nick Morton. It restores life to him, which robs him of his Dracula powers and just makes him a normal man again.
It also instantly dusts his entire army.
Yes, that is important too, because they are his lineage. They are all of his, line of vampire creations. And so as soon as he dies or undies, I guess, they cease to exist.
So, and that's the last that we've seen or heard from Dracula. Throughout all of phase 2, he has not appeared. So he also has ties to various business concerns. We know that he owns the mercury mine that the Wolfman's family is involved with.
Because we have established, as sort of was brought up in the original Mummy movie, that our monsters, pretty much all of them, are weak to mercury, that mercury kills monsters.
Yeah, we established that it has some disruptive influence on magic.
Yes.
And that's the only other bit of recap information from previous episodes that is relevant is that in our film Werewolves of London, we go into a little bit of the repercussions onto Dracula's businesses and his operation. That when Dracula was when Dracula was resurrected and his whole army got dusted, that left all of these prisoners that he had without jailers, and they were able to escape. And one of them is a vampire who swears revenge on Dracula for having been locked up down there. We didn't even give him a name in that movie. He was just played by Joe Taslim of The Raid, The Night Comes for Us, Warrior, whose third season will have just started when you listen to this episode. One of the best shows on television. Please look it up on Max. It's so fucking good.
One of our Warner Brothers sponsors.
Yes.
Which establishes, even though all of the vampires we saw in House of Dracula died, that's because they were from Dracula's lineage.
Right. So there are still some vampires, but they would have to be vampires who are not related. They could be related upwards, but not downwards, right?
Right. Yeah. If there are, which we don't know if there are vampires older than Dracula. That is something we haven't established.
That's right. So that should be everything, because this movie is fairly self-contained in that it is definitely a sequel to House of Dracula, but it is also going off on its own kind of journey. But before I go into that, Dalton, you should give me some more of those expectations.
Yeah, so what's cool about our fans is that we have fans that are invested in our lore and know all this stuff already and have listened to everything. And so we got some expectations based on where we left Dracula, especially regarding his humanity. Fine Artistry on Instagram says, I'd say I'm expecting Dracula to show some sort of internal war within himself. He's alive and therefore more human now. With that new humanity, perhaps he's now able to explore passions and feelings he couldn't as an undead vampire, and actually begins to have a taste for life's wonders, and that conflicts with his vampire side's plans. So sort of the human and non-human parts doing war within himself. And then Ian on Twitter says he is also really excited to see how the concept of a depowered, real-live Dracula is explored, since the only other work of fiction I can think of doing that is one of those Hotel Transylvania movies.
Which I haven't seen.
I haven't either, which is funny because I think that's the closest thing to an actual dark universe that exists.
We have right now. Yeah, and it's Andy Tartakovsky is the director, a great animation director. And oddly enough, our friend Joe Stando, who's the voice of the Invisible Man on a couple of our episodes, was just watching one of those and talking about this with me about how it's an interesting paycheck job for getting Tartakovsky that lets him make things like Primal or stuff like that. But I'm oh yeah, I should probably watch them because I grew up with that director.
Hey, people out there, subscribe to the Patreon and we will watch all the Hotel Transylvania movies for the bonus podcast.
Because have you seen them?
I have not seen them.
Okay, so let's save them for our
for the bonus podcast.
Go on over to patreon.com/Dylan and Dalton, or use the link in the show notes. And when we get to that $200 a month total, we're going to launch our second feed where we'll talk about everything else, including doing an episode about all the Hotel Transylvania movies.
Have now promised so many topics for the bonus podcast. We need to actually hit our goals.
I hope someone's keeping track of them too, because we're not. You have to hold us accountable for those when the show launches.
I do also want to point out that part of Ian's comment, he also said, horror. Give us some of that sweet, sweet horror you promised, Dylan.
Okay, so I want to address this. So, Dalton.
Let me address this.
Let me be clear. You challenged me a couple of episodes ago, I think it was way back at Werewolves of London.
Yes.
That I had to do a movie that was a straight up horror movie at some point, sooner the better, hopefully within phase 2.
Because most of your movies have been in more of the action or comedy or kind of psychological realm, but not a straight up horror movie.
Because from the very beginning of the show, I've kind of always been honest about that. Horror is not my strong suit, which is why it's great that I'm doing this show with you.
Mm-hmm.
So you know how, like with the Phantom episode, when I feel like I'm underperforming in some way for the show, I have a habit of like overcompensating a little bit. So
I like where this is going.
I haven't made a horror story here.
Okay.
I've kind of made 5 horror stories.
Love it. Love to hear it.
What I'm going to tell you in advance about Dracula Lives is that it's sort of an anthology.
Okay.
It's going to have one director.
Okay.
Timo Tadjanto, the director of The Night Comes for Us. He's like a really interesting director who I picked very early on to helm a very different version of this film.
Okay.
Because my initial idea for Dracula Lives was that I wanted to basically do a mafia movie.
Okay.
I wanted it to be sort of like a martial arts infused gangster picture, like The Night Comes for us, like The Raid, something in that vein of like really cool Indonesian crime films, where it was going to be about Dracula trying to rebuild his empire as a human and going up against.
Which, before we get into more detail, we had some expectations about this very topic.
Okay, that's true.
We had a lot of people commenting on this sort of power vacuum with Dracula now being his empire being taken away from him. We had Jason in our Discord saying that he wants a Reign of the Supermen type story with 4 pretenders to Dracula's throne, a rival, Count Orlok, a young woman claiming to be Dracula's daughter, Blackula, and Dracula himself, seemingly unreborn, but in reality a Van Helsing, which that's a very fun premise. I read
that comment and I'm like, damn, that actually that lines up with Reign of the Supermen really well. That might have been a really interesting journey.
Then Wolf Dragon Thing on our Discord says, maybe Dracula lives and he realizes all the parts of life he was missing as a vampire and rediscovers it as he's now human, only for it to be threatened by this new vampire who's trying to fill the power void. He doesn't become a good guy. I would definitely love a more anti-hero vibe to him, like a sort of wild card for the Dark Legion where they don't know which side he'll help.
Well, one of the challenges that I was facing here is the deep desire not to rehabilitate this character. He is a mass murderer. He's just the fucking worst. And
we opened the House of Dracula with him making 2 characters eat and fuck each other to death.
Yeah,
simultaneously.
I don't want to do the thing where we have him come back from that simply because structurally we have to.
Right, we have to now. We've finished our bad guy arc with him. Now he's good.
Yeah, I'm tired of
we kind of did that with Frankenstein.
Yeah, but I mean, like Dragon Ball Z and the Fast movies have ruined this for everyone. We have to stop doing that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to do this sort of gangster movie because there is no real good guy in most gangster movies, right?
Sure.
It's just a matter. It's a matter of like who's the more ruthless and who has the most to lose and how do they outmaneuver each other. But I was setting that up in Werewolves of London with the introduction of Joe Taslim's character, and I had a very specific idea of what I wanted to do. And I was thinking about it, and I was getting frustrated that I was not making it a horror story. And I then started writing another version that was more of a Dracula movie in the vein of the Universal films.
Okay.
And then about 15 pages into that, I threw it away. And then I started another one.
Wow.
And I got about 10 pages into that, and I threw that out.
Damn.
And I was bouncing around so many different ideas for different angles on a Dracula movie that could be set after House of Dracula, that I ended up taking a totally different approach and kind of using a little bit of all of them, even though they're not really super, they would not have all worked as one plot exactly. But if I thought of it as more of a series of stories, like I think this comes together as a whole, but if I had to start from like a new kind of blank check, this might actually be something that I would pitch as a series instead.
Interesting.
And you can tell me because obviously we're not locked into like a release date and the stockholders aren't up our ass about making sure we have a movie out at a certain date. If you think this should just become a Peacock series, I'm open to it.
Peacock because owned by Universal.
Yeah. So the idea that I have done here, this is the only thing that I'll say about the content of it from this point on. The idea here is to place Dracula into all these different horror subgenres. And he's not the monster in any of them because now he's experiencing being vulnerable and being a human being.
Right.
And so what it means to be in a horror movie has completely changed for him. But it's not really just one horror movie. It's 5.
I like the sound of this. And I would like to then go into my expectations for this and we'll see how much they square. This is something we do where we also give expectations for each other's pitches, not as a way of saying your pitch is going to suck if it doesn't do this, but just to talk about where the other person's headspace is. Because I don't know anything about Dylan's pitch other than what he just said.
I just said a lot.
I think that's okay because my expectations are not anything specific. I wasn't looking for a particular scene or a particular character moment or anything like that. But this is a big film for us from numerous directions. On the one hand, this is our first Dracula movie, that we have an entire universe based on the classic Universal monsters. And now, how many movies are we in?
This is number 12, I think, in our canon.
We haven't done a standalone Dracula film until the 12th entry, arguably the Universal monster, like the big one. Maybe Frankenstein is a competitor there, but like really Dracula kicked it all off. And that's partially because we were building him as the villain for our Avengers crossover, right? And we sort of gave like a little mini Dracula movie that opens House of Dracula, like the little cold open there. We give him an arc, but I would feel like there's a lot of eyes on this one. I think this is partially why we got so many enthusiastic responses, is because this is our first time really tackling just Dracula. Mm-hmm. Not Dracula as opposed to the Mummy and Frankenstein and everyone, but just Dracula on his own.
Especially since our Dracula is closer to the classic Dracula than our Frankenstein is to the Universal Frankenstein, than our Wolfman is to the classic Wolfman.
It's a monster we've let be the villain and remain the villain. Yeah.
And there's some pressure here. And I have to say, like, this was the hardest writing challenge I have faced so far on this show.
Well, and that's just one angle, because the other angle is we set up a big promise for Dracula. We gave like this big premise shift, as Ian pointed out, like there's not really any media out there about Dracula becoming human, right? And that was sort of our promise we made to our viewers, to our listeners, that like, hey, we're doing something different here. We gave you the Dracula you know and love, but now what if he's mortal, right? And then we left that dangling for like 5 movies.
Yeah,
right?
We don't usually give people enough time to anticipate stuff because we put out a new imaginary movie every 4 weeks.
And by letting it linger, I feel like that expectation only grows of like, what are they going to do with this character? And how are they? I feel like people have had time. I've had time to think about like, well, what is Dracula? What is his role? What is he going to do without powers? It's a big premise now, and it's a premise that carries a lot of weight. And so more than anything else, what I'm going to be listening for, I think, is fulfilling the promise of the premise. And the premise being not only this is our dark universe Dracula film, full stop, only one so far, this is our debut of how our dark universe handles Dracula, but also this is us fulfilling this brand new premise that we established. It's got, not to add a lot of pressure, but like I feel like that it's gained a lot of weight as we've waited and waited and waited for this type of film. And I want to make sure that we fulfill our promise to our audience, that would be what I'm listening for.
I am really hoping that I do, as opposed to the last couple episodes that we did. And this is another reason why I kind of decided I wanted to try and do a horror movie. Mm-hmm. We've thrown a lot of curveballs at people during phase 2.
Yeah.
There was the secret comedy musical. There was the slasher movie, Frankenstein. Like
a very different Black Lagoon take.
Yeah, exactly. This has been our experimental phase, right? Yeah. This has been our Sergeant Pepper
into the mix.
Exactly. Almost the only one of these that was kind of down the middle so far was Werewolves of London.
And we put an orgy in it. You put an orgy in it.
So I kind of wanted to do something that was not going to be completely and fully out there. And in the process, I may have done something that was completely and fully out there. I'm not sure. It's structurally different from anything that we've done before on the show. But I have tried to take a prismatic approach to the character and to writing a horror story. And this has been kind of, a real growing experience for me as a writer.
Love to hear it.
And we have been recording for 20 minutes. We will be here for 3 more hours. I think we should get into it.
Let's get into it.
I'm going to tell you, as I think I already posted about this, rather than a 3-act structure, this story is told in 5 chapters.
Okay.
So we'll probably want to take a break between because they're basically their own stories. They're not their own. They are linear.
We tend to take multiple breaks anyway. This probably fits better into our podcast flow anyway.
Yeah. So, without any further ado, submitted for the approval of the Universal Pictures Board of Directors. This is Dylan Roth's Dracula Lives. We open on the terrified face of a middle-aged man wearing well-groomed facial hair and a wide, ruffled collar. We are in the 16th century, in the bedchamber of a noble French couple. 2 other men are speaking, but we don't see them.
I don't think I'll ever get used to that. It's unsettling.
Oh, I, for one, relish it. The Frenchman's breathing quickens as he tries to keep from screaming. His collar unbuttons behind him, seemingly by itself, and is lifted delicately off his neck as if by strings. He squeezes his eyes shut and starts whispering a prayer in French. Meanwhile, the conversation continues. It's a reminder to me of what they are and we are not. The Frenchman's neck is suddenly violently punctured in 2 places, inches apart. Blood flows out of the wounds, but before it can pour down his neck, it reverses direction, pulled upward and away into the air before vanishing.
And what's that?
The camera pans, and we learn that we have been looking at the Frenchman's reflection in the mirror of his wife's vanity. When we fully turned around to a reverse angle, taking the point of view of the mirror itself, we can see that another man is hunched behind him, sinking his teeth into the Frenchman's neck. The Frenchman chokes out a scream, and after a moment falls limp out of his chair. The man behind him wipes his mouth with a handkerchief and looks up at us, at the mirror in which he is invisible. He is a pale white man with angular features and piercing eyes, which turn from gray to red as his victim's blood pumps through his veins. This is Dracula, played by Mads Mikkelsen. They are unliving. A woman across the room screams. She's being held at the shoulders by the man with whom Dracula has been conversing, Ahul, played by Joe Taslim, a tall, muscular East Asian man in his physical prime. He and Dracula are both dressed in sleek, simple black and red finery, totally at home in this luxurious bedroom. The woman continues to scream as she watches the blood pool around her husband's body. There are more bodies all around the room, belonging to servants and staff. The lady of the house is the only resident left standing, and she knows she won't be for long. There's no one left to answer her screams, but she screams anyway until silence. With a wave of Dracula's hand, the lady's voice falls silent and still, but she's still screaming with her eyes. Look around you, Ahul. What do you see? Ahul, still holding the lady, scans the room with his eyes. Dracula paces the bedroom.
Art, fashion, the trappings of wealth.
Things, little brother. Things. Whatever their material value, they are simply objects to be used, admired, and ultimately dispensed with. They break, they decay, they die. Humans are no different. They cast a reflection, just like any other object. Dracula drapes his arm over Ahul's shoulder and leads him, and the woman in his clutches, towards the vanity, kicking her husband's body out of the way. Ahul sits the paralyzed lady down in his chair, and the 2 men loom over her shoulder, facing the mirror. Do you know why the mirror can't see us?
I suspect you're about to tell me.
Because the mirror only sees dead things. The lady looks into her own eyes in the mirror, going quietly mad. Her captors do not appear in the reflection. Dracula gingerly removes the lady's ruffled collar and gestures to Ahul, offering him her neck. He shakes his head.
I've had my fill. Haven't you?
Dracula smiles at the lady's reflection and leans down to her level. She can't see him, but she feels his breath on her neck. She winces and squeezes her eyes tight as tears roll down her cheeks. Never. Dracula opens his mouth wide and his incisor teeth grow long and sharp. As he lunges to bury them in the lady's neck, we smash cut to a new scene. Dracula gasps and stumbles through the dank, cavernous cellar beneath Castle Dracula. Mere minutes ago, this was the site of a great battle. Fresh dust, ash, and rubble is scattered across the stone floor, but there's not another soul in sight. There is only Count Dracula, dressed in a modern black and white suit, flecked with blood. Some of the blood is his. He has bruises on his face, and there's a thin cut on his lower lip. He's breathless, exhausted, limping through the ruins. His foot comes down awkwardly on a wet cobblestone, and he falls forward, landing on his hands and knees in a shallow pool of blood. He grunts in frustration and starts to lift himself when he is suddenly transfixed by something. We don't see what, in the pool below. He raises a hand to his face and traces the outline of his jaw, his lips, smearing blood across his skin, with a look of utter horror on his face. A face he hasn't seen in nearly 600 years. Gawks back at him, reflected in blood. Dracula's eyes open wide and he lets out a guttural scream which echoes throughout the halls of the castle. Title: Dracula Lives.
See, now this is what I was talking about. I think this absolutely fulfills the promise of the premise in this intro scene.
Thank you.
I love the idea of picking up immediately after the events of House of Dracula with like he has just been turned mortal, because we didn't get to see that. We didn't get to see him reckon with his mortality, other than he kind of mourns it in the moment, but our focus is on the Dark Legion, right? And their victory.
For those of you who are freaks about the timeline and like to like re-experience things in chronological order, probably less fun to do with this podcast than it is with like Marvel movies.
Yeah.
Dracula Lives takes place immediately after House of Dracula. You would slot it there before The Mummy Returns in our chronology.
Okay. But I just love picking up immediately at that moment and yeah, like picking what is the thing that is going to make it sink in for him, right? And I think him seeing his reflection in a pool of blood is about as cool as you could do for that kind of thing. Especially when you set it up with this monologue about, you know, why vampires don't have their reflection. It's obviously meaningful to him that he can't see his reflection, and then to see that taken away, that is a very strong opening. Now, just to be clear, because I was a little fuzzy on this, Ahul is not the person who is being drained of blood at the very beginning.
No,
right?
they're draining this Frenchman. Ahul is his companion there.
Oh, okay. Because we're hearing his voice and we're talking about the Frenchman. I was like, wait, is Ahul the Frenchman? But no, he's already a vampire. They're just draining some other people that are in this home.
Yes.
Okay. So
the noble couple that is essentially a prop in these scenes.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. I love that intro. I think that is that's what people. I mean, I don't know for sure. That's what I want to see after where we left things in House of Dracula.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on. Chapter 1, The Servant. Count Dracula sits at the head of his dining room table. It's only hours after the Battle of Castle Dracula, and he still wears his weathered suit and a smear of blood across his face. The dining room has a wide picture window that looks over the castle grounds. The sun's coming up, casting light on the side of Dracula's face. He does not turn to look at it. He just stares forward down the length of the long, empty table. He sees the sunlight creep its way towards his right hand, which rests on the table in front of him. For a moment, he tenses up reflexively. Then he stills himself. He watches as the shadow of the window pane slowly recedes and the light touches the edge of his hand. Nothing happens. Dracula's response to this is indecipherable. Is it relief? Disappointment? Shame?
Picturing Mads Mikkelsen in this scene is perfect because he has such like a stone face that like he's got the ultimate poker face, but it always looks kind of sad and angry. And so his expression in this, like I can see it very clearly in my head.
Thank you. I write towards that a lot in this.
Good.
Dracula's focus is broken by a banging sound behind him as the door from the kitchen is shoved open by a rolling tea cart. Pushing the cart is a thin young man in a butler's tuxedo. His suit is crisp, his face is clean-shaven, but his eyes are sunken and bloodshot. This is Renfield, played by Barry Keoghan.
The audience applauds like Kramer bursting into Jerry's apartment. Renfield!
Renfield rolls the cart alongside Dracula's place setting and starts to serve. Eggs over easy.
He does.
By the way, my big tribute to Bram Stoker in this script is describing every meal in detail.
That's why the script is so long.
Yes. Eggs over easy, toast, bacon, baked beans, grilled tomatoes, and a cup of piping hot tea. Dracula eyes his breakfast like it is roadkill on a plate.
I hope you'll pardon the tragically Irish nature of this meal. It's what I know. We had a Romanian chef on the day shift, but she's run off along with the rest of them.
By the rest of them, may I assume you mean?
Everyone, sir.
Dracula says nothing. To express anger or disappointment in his human servants would be to overstate their importance to him.
You really must eat, master. You need your strength.
Dracula lifts his fork tentatively and punctures the egg. Its yolk oozes across the plate.
I'd soak that up with the toast, sir.
Dracula does so, never acknowledging Renfield, as if pretending that he'd come up with the idea himself independently. He completes his first mouthful of real food in centuries and does not comment or emote. He wipes his mouth with his napkin and moves on to the tomatoes as if he did this every day. Renfield's slight waiting smile gradually fades. He tries something else.
Master, I know that such confidence is typically beyond my station as your procurer, but seeing as it's just the two of us,
Now Dracula looks at him, but only out of the corner of his eye as he takes a bite of sausage.
I was wondering if you could explain to me what happened to you and to the rest of the night shift, sir.
Dracula sips his tea.
From what I heard, you were close to becoming some sort of a gatekeeper of life and death.
God. I was going to become the god of death.
And something went wrong.
We flash back violently to the climax of the Dark Legion House of Dracula. In the cellar of the castle, the same place we saw him earlier, a still vampiric Dracula kneels before a glowing figure standing in a storm of light and dark magic. We're not going to show the figure's face because having Tom Cruise appear would be both expensive and distracting. Dracula is flanked by a small army of vampires.
Your centuries are up, Dracula. 100 lifetimes spent killing from the shadows because you fear the darkness.
Dracula cowers, buffeted by the whirlwind of dust and energy. No, I won't go back there. I won't cross that threshold again.
Not today. Today we give you a gift. The gift of life.
Bandages unspool from the figure's wrists and wrap themselves around Dracula, tightening across his body like a mummy. No, not that. You don't know what you're doing. It's coming for all of us sooner or later, even yourself. Together we could defeat death for good. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back to me. The bandages wrap around his mouth, silencing him. A blinding yellow light comes from under the bandages, and then they dissolve. Dracula sits up, looks at himself. He's less pale, with color in his cheeks. His fangs are gone. He's human. All around the room, the remaining vampires begin to turn to dust, one by one. They howl out in pain, and then they're gone. We see a look of horror on Dracula's face as one of his lieutenants' ashy remains blows past him. We cut back to the present, to the dining room table. When the gods cursed me with mortality, it had the same effect upon my forces as if they'd killed me outright. Every vampire with a drop of my blood in their veins, every single one of my children, everywhere, was turned to dust in an instant. Dracula's choice of words imply an attachment, a terrible loss, and yet there's no trace of such feeling in the way he says them. In close-up, he is a businessman describing a difficult day at the office. From a wider angle of Dracula and Renfield alone in the immense dining room, however, the Count's emptiness is undeniable. Cautiously, Renfield reaches out and places his right hand over Dracula's left, the one that the sunlight hasn't touched yet.
I'm so sorry, sir.
Dracula doesn't pull away or acknowledge Renfield's gesture at all. He takes a last sip of his tea with his right hand, and then gets up from the table. Renfield remains where he is and watches as Dracula turns his back, exits the dining room, closing the door behind him. Cut to Dracula violently, painfully vomiting his breakfast into the toilet in the ornate master bathroom. The Irish breakfast was perhaps too rich for his empty stomach. He washes his face and looks up from the sink. There's no mirror there, of course. There never has been, for as long as he's lived there. Today, he notices and stares at the wood paneling. Dracula tours his empty castle. There are so many rooms upstairs that he's rarely visited, and he's never seen any of them in the daylight. He wanders his way to a guest bedroom, the same room where he recently locked away vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing, disguised as attorney Jonathan Harker, in the prologue of House of Dracula. Dracula runs his hand over the surface of a worn 19th century writing desk by the window. There are many memories in this room to which we are not privy. Van Helsing is far from the only victim to be imprisoned here. Over his shoulder, Renfield enters the room and speaks.
Would you like this room serviced, sir?
Dracula, with his back to Renfield, winces a bit at the sound of his voice. Only 12 hours ago, it was impossible for anyone to sneak up on Count Dracula. Renfield's done it twice in one morning. The lurking unsettles him. No, I'll be sleeping in the master bedroom.
Then, if I may, sir, my own quarters are 2 flights down. As I'm now the only staff member, it might be prudent for me to be close at hand.
You want to move in here?
If I may, master.
I trust you're aware of this room's history, its accoutrements.
Yes, sir. I don't mind at all.
Very well, then. Go get your things.
Thank you, master.
Later that night, Dracula settles into the master bedroom. Renfield has laid out a set of silk pajamas for him, monogrammed with a D. Alone in the room, Dracula picks them up and examines them, having clearly never seen them before. He starts changing out of his suit, and he hears rustling from the guest room, or rather Renfield's room, next door. Curious, Dracula slides open a panel in the wall that adjoins the 2 rooms, revealing a one-way peephole. Renfield is unpacking his suitcase. He hangs up a matching set of pajamas, monogrammed with an R. Dracula shuts the peephole and shudders. He leaves his own set on the floor. Cut to Dracula in bed, clearly uncomfortable between his sheets. He tosses and turns. He tries sleeping above the covers. He tries pulling them over his head. Eventually, with some difficulty, he falls asleep. We fade in on a wooded mountaintop at night. Dracula is wandering barefoot, wearing something out of the 15th century, something he might have slept in during his first mortal life. Amidst the tall trees stands a black wooden door, mounted in a doorframe attached to nothing. Cautiously, Dracula approaches the door, which whispers to him in garbled, unsubtitled Romanian. He slowly reaches for the door handle and tries to turn it, but it's locked. Only now does he notice the large silver key hanging around his neck on a silver chain. He lifts the chain over his head and slips the key into the lock below the handle. The moment he turns the key, the handle begins to shake, and the door starts to rumble in its frame. The key falls out of the lock, into the dirt below. The whispers are growing louder. Dracula falls backward onto his tailbone and crawls away from the door. The door shakes loudly, and the whispers are becoming a raspy roar. The door opens just a crack, and Dracula dives forward to push it closed. He puts his back to the door and leans his whole body weight against it, but he can't hold it for long. He sees the key sitting on the ground next to his legs. He picks it up and whirls around to fit it into the lock, only to find the key is now red hot, searing his fingers. He hisses and drops the key in the dirt again, losing sight of it. He digs frantically through the loose earth, but the key is gone. Behind him, something pounds on the other side of the door, enough to knock him away from it. He's lying face down in the dirt now, facing away from the door as it suddenly swings open, releasing the inferno within. Dracula is engulfed in flames and turned to ash in the blink of an eye. Dracula jolts awake in his bed, drenched in sweat. He grabs his hand, the one that had held the burning key, and finds it unharmed. He clutches it to his chest, tries to slow his breathing. Next, we see him splash water on his face in the bathroom, just as he did earlier. This time, when he looks up, he's startled by his own reflection. He turns on the bathroom light and finds that a mirror has been hung up over the sink. Behind him, hanging from a hook on the door, are his monogram pajamas. It's the next morning, and the poorly slept Count awaits breakfast in the dining room. Renfield arrives with a tea cart again, with a much milder meal this time.
This ought to agree with your stomach a bit better, master.
Dracula raises an eyebrow. He has not mentioned yesterday's digestive issues to his servant. Regardless, he moves directly to another pressing issue. You are not to enter my bedroom while it is occupied without my explicit orders.
Please forgive my overreach, sir. It won't happen again.
Dracula takes a sip of tea and shoots Renfield a cold look that says, it certainly won't. Cut to Dracula holding a remote business meeting in his office. He sits behind a large wooden desk before a large monitor that displays a grid of business people of different nationalities. We join in the middle of the conversation. And so, given this substantial shortfall, Condé International will be restructuring aggressively. You've each been called to this meeting because my shares in your company have been sold. We hear assorted gasps, curses, and other panicked chatter from the other callers. One of them, who is unfamiliar to us, speaks loudest and clearest.
Sold to whom?
To the highest bidders, of course. I've spent the weeks since the incident courting offers from a variety of global enterprises. Some of you will find yourselves under a common umbrella, but most of you will be under unique management. Details will follow shortly via email. More angry chatter. A new voice rises. This one we've heard before.
You mean to say that you're relinquishing control of North America's richest deposit of mercury? Your most valuable weapon?
It's John Talbot, played by Jared Harris, president of the Talbot Mining Company, father of our Wolfman, and widower of Rita Talbot, one of Dracula's lieutenants. Maintaining control over quicksilver mining was necessary to ensure the safety of the vampires in my employ. As I no longer employ any vampires, their safety is no longer my concern.
No longer employ... You cold-blooded bastard. That's my wife you're talking about. Rita joined your pack to ensure the future of our business, and now she's died in your service, and this is how you repay her sacrifice.
It's how I repay her failure. More cries of outrage. Dracula wears the slightest smirk. The moment the call ends, his expression falls, and he pivots in his chair to vomit into a pail he's had waiting nearby. Renfield, who has been standing just off camera, hurries to his side.
There, master.
Fuck off, Robert!
I can't imagine what's causing these fits.
It's that rubbish you're feeding me. It's a wonder that any of your kind ever get more than 10 feet from the toilet.
Your body is bound to adjust to solid food any day now, sir.
Renfield circles behind Dracula and takes hold of the handles in the back of his chair and pushes it away from his desk. It's only now that we see that Dracula is in a wheelchair, noticeably frail and thin. Renfield wheels Dracula down one of the castle's long corridors.
Once again, I beg you to let me fly in a specialist. With our resources, particularly after the latest offloading of stock, we can afford a house call from any physician on the planet.
What I have, they can't cure. Have you been able to reach Victoire?
No, master. Still no word from any of the former colleagues I've asked to look for her. Not that the familiars I'm still in touch with are worth much, sir. Disgraceful fuckers, the lot of them, abandoning their master at the first sign of trouble. I heard a nasty rumor that Miro has thrown in with Prodigium.
Miro? Am I supposed to have heard of him?
A day shift security man, and a former lover of mine.
Pathetic.
I agree, sir. Joining the ranks of our enemies like that.
Pathetic that he fucked you, Renfield.
If you say so, master.
Did he fuck you in my house?
Almost exclusively.
I may vomit again.
The bucket's in your lap, master.
Later, Renfield wheels Dracula into the master bedroom.
Shall I help you change for bed, sir?
I'll manage.
Let's see you stand up, then.
Dracula rolls his eyes and with some significant effort rises to his feet. He turns to face Renfield and waves his arm theatrically, like a sarcastic stage magician.
Very well, sir. I'll be next door if you need anything.
Renfield departs and Dracula shambles to the bathroom where he primps in his unfamiliar reflection. He studies his hairline. Was it always this thin? He runs his fingers through it and pulls back a mess of loose strands. What is happening to him? Seconds later, we see flashes of the door, the key, the flames, and Dracula awakens in bed with a start. He kicks off his sheets in a panic, but he gets tangled in them and rolls off the bed, landing hard on the floor, but not before bumping his forehead against the edge of the nightstand. He reaches for his wheelchair, but only manages to push it farther away. Frustrated and bleeding onto his rug, he employs his last resort. Renfield! Renfield, assist me! Robert! When he hears no answer, he keeps calling louder and louder until it begins to sound desperate. There's no response from Renfield's room, but our perspective rises from the floor where Dracula lies helpless, rotates to face the room's shared wall, and closes in on the peephole between them. Renfield can hear Dracula's pleas. He's awake, standing, leaning against the wall as if trying to feel Dracula's cries reverberate through them. His face stretches into a gaunt grimace as he presses against the wall with one hand and masturbates with the other. Fade to hours later as we follow a narrow trail of blood from the bedside across the bedroom to the door, in front of which Dracula lies passed out. A key turns in the lock and the door opens, bumping against his prone body. He moans, regaining consciousness. Renfield, the door. Why was it locked? Renfield pushes the door open, rolling the Count onto his side.
You poor dear. I told you to call me if you needed anything.
You didn't answer. Where were you? Renfield lifts the bony Dracula in his arms and plants him on the bed.
I'm so sorry, Master. I couldn't hear you. The walls in these old castles were built to last. Built for battle, weren't they, sir? It's no wonder the sound doesn't carry.
Renfield frets over Dracula's pillow and adjusts his sheets.
Perhaps it might be best if I pulled a cot into your room, Master, just until you're feeling better.
Dracula tries to object, but is too parched to speak.
I'll go fix your tea. Be right back.
Dracula watches, bleary-eyed, as Renfield leaves the room. He hears the click of the lock on his bedroom door. We watch Dracula's sunken eyes as he struggles to think. We'll trust Mads Mikkelsen and the director to convey the following visually. The door was locked. Why would he lock the door? Why is this happening? Is this mortality? Is this what it is to be human? Why was the door locked? How could Renfield not hear his cries? Now he thinks he can make up for it with the tea. Always the tea. The tea. His eyes widen. The lock clicks open again and Renfield rolls in with his cart and a steaming hot teapot. Renfield pours him a cup.
This will help.
Dracula waves the teacup away from his face. I can't. I'm too weak. Unperturbed, Renfield tries to feed the tea directly. Dracula turns his head away, and Renfield pulls him back by the chin. The tea is obviously too hot. He squeezes his mouth open and pours the hot liquid inside. The Count winces.
You need your medicine.
With that, Dracula spits the mouthful of tea into Renfield's face, splashing his eyes with the scalding liquid. Renfield screams and recoils, clutching his face. Dracula, weak but not quite as weak as he let on, dives out of bed and pins Renfield to the ground. He may not have his strength, but 600 years of experience as a sadistic monster doesn't just fade away. He digs his thumbnails into Renfield's throat, stifling his screams and drawing blood. Filth! Putrid, unliving filth! Renfield grasps around on the floor around him and finds the fallen teacup. He smashes it against Dracula's head, but the Count doesn't even flinch as blood starts to pour down his face. He heaves his breaths, willing to use his very last if it means killing his treacherous former lapdog. Renfield scratches and claws beneath him, hooking his fingers into Dracula's mouth. Dracula bites down hard and doesn't let go. He digs his teeth into his enemy's fingers and his thumbs into his enemy's throat until the malignant manservant screams and grunts become gurgles and pops. Dracula releases the limp Renfield, who is not yet dead but squarely defeated. His barely conscious body leans against the wheelchair. Dracula struggles to his feet and stumbles back against the bed. When he's recovered his breath, Dracula says, "You were never my favorite." Renfield chortles blood out of his mouth, nose, and neck. It's agony, but he smiles and mouths, "I know." His face goes slack. Dracula lets himself collapse fully onto the bed, and we pull back to regard the bloody scene from a distance. The Count is alone. Fade out. End of chapter 1.
Okay. So a little intimate little sequence here of Dracula versus Renfield.
Yeah, I kind of picked a different sort of touchstone for a different kind of horror that I wanted him to experience. I had an idea for like potentially a feature that was more Renfield centric that would have explored like the weird legacy of this being like maybe the third or fourth Renfield, and every member of his family has been promised to become a vampire. It never happens. But between the movie Renfield, What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show, and a bunch of other stuff, it felt like it wasn't working.
Right.
But I wanted to do like Misery with Dracula.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also, and you let me know if I've done not enough here. I'm trying to follow your example in the Black Lagoon and not explain every single one of the characters' motivations all the time.
Sure.
So you're giving me a look.
No, I'm thinking, because I am of two minds about this. Because at first it's interesting, like it's almost like I would need to listen to this back to know exactly. I like so much of the stuff in here. I love Dracula sort of adjusting to being mortal, the stuff with the sunlight, not having the mirror above his sink, not even just like being uncomfortable in sheets, right? I think that stuff is all very good. I like him being weak and frail as sort of a contrast to the Dracula that obviously we saw in the Dark Legion. I think I wasn't expecting it to be this like small self-contained story. I thought, and so I was almost listening to it in the wrong headspace, where I was like, oh, we're just in the castle sort of establishing this new normal before the plot starts. And then I was like, oh no, we've been in the plot of this sort of miniature thing. Because up until sort of the tea stuff, when it becomes clear that, oh, Renfield is like trying to keep Dracula weak and frail, I was thinking, like, oh, you know what? I bet some of this stuff can be cut, and sort of, trimmed down, because like I almost want us to come back from the title right into the dream sequence.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first instinct, where like, yes, the stuff like at breakfast is all very good stuff, but it feels like it could be integrated into the scene with him on the call and with like his other employees, quote unquote. It almost felt like there's this old adage, I don't remember who said this, but in like when you're writing a novel, that you should write the novel and then just cut your first chapter.
Right.
I was kind of getting that vibe where it was like, oh, this is all really good place setting stuff that I kind of don't want. You know, like,
I mean, I burned myself a little bit with exposition that probably in the context of our podcast, I didn't need to put in the script.
I was thinking about that too, like the flashback to House of Dracula. I was like, you know what? And I could be wrong about this, but my instinct is like, I don't think we need that. I think all we need to know is there is a Dracula who is now mortal, like, which we see in the reflection of the blood. Like that's established in the cold open. I'm kind of like, we don't need to know any other lore.
Some of this stuff does come back into play later, which is why I felt like we need to have it.
Yeah, I was
like, I don't talk about the Dark Legion at all because they're not important to this story, but the idea that he was trying to become the god of death and it didn't work out. We're going to be digging into further his motivations, how that all worked, and it does come back around. So I felt like I had to have it.
I wonder if there's like just a sort of more gradual way we could sort of introduce that stuff without a full flashback. Because it does kind of feel like we have all this momentum coming out of the cold open, and then we kind of really slow things down. And my instinct was just like, let's go right to the dream sequence, and then him firing everyone and seeing John Talbot, and then we let the story go. And this sort of the breakfast, the light on his hand, and this establishing of the thing with Renfield, we can sort of weave all that in as the plot starts to develop. But then I realized that we've been in the plot. You know, we've been doing this Renfield thing. And so that's why I might be totally wrong about all this, because I didn't know that's where we were, that we were doing this sort of like little self-contained prologue story. And I think it's all going to depend on how the rest of the movie plays out. Because part of me is like, could this story be woven into whatever comes next, so that things feel like they escalate, to outside of the castle more? But I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen next. So it might be, no, this is the perfect first chapter. That's how it should go. Or I might end up coming back and being like, maybe we could combine like these two stories.
Right.
And let
well,
them
let's
happen
circle
together,
back to it. Because right now there's 5.
Yes.
But maybe there doesn't have to be 5, or maybe there needs to be 6. Who knows, right? But that's where that one ends. And so we do a full fade to black, and then we come back up with a rainy night in London, 1931. A man in an overcoat runs through a secluded graveyard. Stumbling, he catches himself on a headstone, and we see a trickle of blood run down his hand from the inside of his sleeve. We follow the length of his arm and find the face of a gray-bearded man, exhausted, spattered in blood and dirt. A large silver cross dangles from a string around his neck. In his other hand, he holds a wooden stake about a foot long. This is Atticus, played by Sam Neill.
Ooh.
He is about to meet his end.
Aww.
After taking a moment to catch his breath, Atticus looks up and finds Dracula, dressed in the iconic fashion of Bela Lugosi's Count, standing before him. Atticus cries out, backs away, and falls into the mud. He brandishes his cross, holding it up towards Dracula, who doesn't even flinch.
Back! Back, you devil! The power of Christ compels...
Dracula grins as he swats the cross out of Atticus's hand with ease. Christ holds no more power over me than you do, Atticus. Dracula looms over the aged doctor's body, and Atticus makes a desperate jab with his stake. I guess I haven't established that he's a doctor. Now we know. Atticus makes a desperate jab with his stake. Dracula discards this just as easily. Atticus knows he's beaten. He says, raggedly,
I have children.
Is that a plea for your life?
No, demon. It's a warning. We have taken an oath. Where I have failed, my children will succeed. And if they do not, then their children or their children's children will kill you.
Let them come. I look forward to killing them all, one by one, until I have swallowed every drop of Van Helsing blood. We see Atticus's horrified face as Dracula descends upon him, and our view is swallowed by the blackness of Dracula's cape. Chapter 2, The Slayer.
Now, I like, and I think I see where this is going, and I like it. Do we need to talk about the Dark Universe Omnibus at all?
Let's talk about it later.
Okay.
Count Dracula looks out the window of a luxurious diner car on a high-speed train halfway between Budapest and Zurich. The sun is hidden beneath the trees of the Swiss countryside. Dracula is seated at a dining table, alone. A black wooden cane with a silver wolf's head handle rests beside him. He's looking thin and sickly, not much better than when we last saw him. An attractive young waiter sets a schnitzel and a glass of wine down on the table in front of him. He smiles at him, and he smiles back because, even at his worst, this is still Mads Mikkelsen. But Dracula holds eye contact for a second longer than is comfortable, and the waiter turns away awkwardly and leaves him to his meal and his disappointment. He has lost his supernatural draw. Dracula picks at his schnitzel and tries to enjoy the dining experience now that he's no longer being poisoned.
Hey, Renfield was also picking at his schnitzel, if you know what I mean.
Oh.
Sorry.
He would never admit to have missed this bit of human pleasure, but he has. The wine is excellent. He finishes his meal and, with the aid of his cane, walks forward to the next compartment. As he rises, a young woman tracks him with her eyes from behind a menu. Once he's passed her by, she closes the menu and turns around to keep an eye on him. This is Adelaide, played by Micah Monroe.
Who avid listeners of this podcast may remember where we know Micah Monroe from, but I assume we will talk about that soon.
Yes. Let's talk about it at the end of the chapter.
Yep.
Dracula arrives at a sleeper car where he has reserved a private single compartment. He lays his head down and drifts off to sleep. We cut to the middle of Dracula's recurring dream. Dracula digs his fingers into the sizzling hot earth of the burning forest, trying to keep his grip as the mysterious door, which is now fully open, inhales. The flames are pulled towards the door too, clinging to the branches of the dying trees and licking at Dracula's skin as it's sucked into the impossible abyss. One of the trees in front of him loses an arm and it hurtles towards him, flying straight into his face. As it strikes him, Dracula startles awake, only to be startled a second time as he sees a young woman, Adelaide, standing over his bed about to plunge a dagger into his heart. The dagger comes down as he rolls off the bed and onto the floor, and Adelaide hits only foam and feathers. Dracula keeps rolling, colliding with Adelaide's shins and knocking her off her feet and towards the cot. Dracula struggles to his feet, but Adelaide recovers quickly and nails him in the chest with a thrust kick. She pins him to the wall of the narrow compartment with her foot and readies her knife, but she has to lower her leg in order to reach him with the dagger. Dracula lowers himself along with it and ducks her next blow, escaping out into the corridor. He's left his cane behind and is forced to lean some of his weight against the walls as he slumps forward towards the aft of the train in the direction of the dining car. Adelaide appears over Dracula's shoulder and runs at him, dagger at the ready. He tries to dodge her, but can only manage to get stabbed in the shoulder instead of the neck. Adelaide tries to pull the dagger out for a second stab, but it sticks a little, giving Dracula time to elbow her in the solar plexus and make a run for it. The sliding door in front of him opens on command, and he slips into the next compartment. Now in the dining car, Dracula takes a seat against the wall, with his back to the door, both giving him a bit of cover and obscuring the dagger sticking out of his back from the rest of the diners and staff. He picks up a menu and tries to act casual. The waiter from earlier approaches him.
Back already?
The waiter regards Dracula more closely and notices the sheen of sweat on his skin.
Are you all right?
Before Dracula can answer, a serrated steel blade bursts through the waiter's chest. He looks down in shock, then screams as the knife pulls back through him. He falls down, revealing Adelaide, who readies for another strike. The rest of the diners panic and flee as Dracula wrestles with Adelaide from his seat. At present, she's a lot stronger than he is. Her blade is about an inch from his eye when another member of the waitstaff tackles Adelaide off of him. Dracula uses the opportunity to get up and run, as best he can, to the next car, and the next, frightening passengers as he passes by with a bloodied mouth and a blade in his shoulder. Dracula finally arrives at a baggage car full of stacked up crates and luggage and no other people. With some difficulty, he pulls the dagger free from his back so that he can shimmy between 2 stacks of wooden cargo crates. And just in time, too, as Adelaide, now covered in the blood of at least one more waiter, slides open the door to the car.
Come out and face me.
Adelaide stalks through the compartment while Dracula does his best to breathe very, very quietly. The Count has walked the earth for half a millennium. This fear is new.
I've spent most of my life waiting for this, training for this. So did my father, my uncle, and their father before them. They each did it their own way. Papa and Nana, they were soldiers. Tried to kick it with prodigium for a while, then raised their own army. Fought fair, faced you head on. You know how that generation was. Dad and Uncle Abe, they thought they could be like James Bond. Build covers, run quiet little surgical ops, and pick away at you over decades. It took you longer, but you got them eventually. And poor Aunt Mina, she never asked for any of this.
Adelaide scrapes the point of her knife along one of the wooden crates, behind which Dracula is staying as still as he can.
Every time one of Uncle Abe's little schemes barely put a dent in your profits or resources, I always used to ask him, you know where he lives, and you know where he sleeps. Why don't you just plow through the gates at high noon and blow up his whole fucking house? And he would get self-righteous and talk about all the human beings you had working on the estate or the poor thralls locked up in the dungeon, how we shouldn't sacrifice the very people we were fighting for. We're not terrorists, he'd say, and then he'd have me run an extra 10 laps around the gym.
She stabs the knife into the side of the crate, inches from Dracula's head.
They're all dead now. I'm the only one left.
She yanks it back out and keeps walking, apparently unaware of how close she just came to her target.
I never thought it'd go down like this. You're just some guy now. Kind of a little bitch, actually. But you've killed more people than I've ever met, so if you think I'm gonna show pity or take it easy on you, that I'm not gonna do whatever it takes to make sure you never hurt another person again, then you're mistaking me for the wrong Van Helsing.
Adelaide turns around and walks towards the door on the forward side of the car, where she came from. Before she walks through it, she turns back and says,
I'm Adelaide, by the way. See you in hell.
Adelaide exits and the door closes behind her. Dracula waits for a moment before shimmying out of his hiding place, then dives back into cover when he hears a door open and 2 sets of footfalls, but from the opposite side of the car. 2 armed police officers hurry through the aisle past him. In subtitled German, we hear someone over their walkie-talkies. She's headed for the cabin. Mother of God, I think she wants to derail us. We have to stop. There's a bang and the transmission cuts out. After the officers have gone, Dracula limps out of hiding once again and walks forward to the next vestibule between cars. The wind rushes by his face. They're in the middle of the mountains, traveling at nearly 150 miles per hour. Jumping off would be suicide. As he considers his plight, his fear is overtaken by the rage and frustration over how fucking unacceptable this situation is. He tightens his grip on the dagger, which is still slick with his blood, and he makes for the front of the train. Dracula retreads his steps through the rows of frightened passengers, using the seat headrests to steady himself along the way. He passes through the sleeping car and grabs his cane. In the diner, he steps over the bodies of the 2 waiters. Patrons cower in corners. Dracula, ashamed to have emulated them only minutes earlier, won't look at them. As Dracula moves forward, the echoes of gunshots and raised voices grow louder in the corridors. The closer he gets to the front of the train, the more bodies he finds. Cops, staff, and passengers, killed not only by stab wounds but by gunfire. Dracula reaches the cab of the train, which is what you call the cockpit of a train, in case anybody doesn't know that. Dracula reaches the cab of the train, whose door is wedged open by the corpse of the conductor. Adelaide sits in the conductor's seat, fiddling with the controls. There's a bend in the tracks ahead, and at the speed the train's going, it won't be pretty. Dracula, for once benefiting from how frail he's become, empties his chest of air and slowly and carefully sidesteps through the doorway. Even he is surprised when he makes it across without attracting Adelaide's attention. Once both his feet are planted behind Adelaide's chair, he grips his cane at either end, quickly whips it down across her throat, and wrenches back with all his weight. Adelaide grabs the cane and tries to push it clear of her airway, but Dracula braces his feet against the back of her chair, tightening his hold. She unsheathes her hunting knife and swings it wildly at her attacker, but she can't reach him. Thinking quickly, she stops flailing and starts sawing away at the cane itself. Knowing that his time is running out and that his life now depends on the strength of his walking stick, Dracula pulls with his entire body. Adelaide's sawing gets faster, then slower, then finally stops. He only needs to gather one last surge of energy, and he'll crush her throat. But before he can muster the strength, the cabin floods with another wave of cops and crew. A uniformed officer pulls Dracula off of Adelaide and, with significantly more force, yanks the dazed Adelaide from her seat and shoves her to the floor, bashing her teeth. A relief engineer takes her place and starts working the controls, slowing the train to cruising speed ahead of the sharp turn. Weak, Dracula sinks into the corner of the cab, prompting a crew member to bend down next to him and shine a flashlight into his eyes. She tries to swat her away, but is ignored. And in no time at all, he is swaddled in a baby blue shock blanket. Adelaide is pinned to the floor with a cop's knee on her back, but manages to turn her head to face Dracula. She flashes him a bloody, broken grin. Dracula can only watch as the still breathing Adelaide Van Helsing is lifted up and dragged away in handcuffs. Until next time. End of chapter 2.
So let's talk about Adelaide.
Let's talk about Adelaide. Gio introduced a character played by our friend Giovanni Colantonio, our first guest that we ever had on the show, as like a full episode guest.
Yeah.
Introduced a character in his pitch for a Dark Universe anthology video game, who was, at the time, we didn't really know what her deal was, but over the course of our conversation, determined that she was a Van Helsing.
Yes, she's from the lineage. Yeah. Because we had killed Van Helsing in the Dark Legion House of Dracula in the opening scene.
And he cast Micah Monroe, and I thought that was great. And I realized that I thought I wanted to do something with that character all the way back when he pitched that, and I was kind of, when Dracula Lives was just a germ of an idea. Every draft that I came up with for this had Adelaide in it in some capacity.
I'm glad because, that was also the thing where, like, we killed Van Helsing so quickly, and what is a Dark Universe without a Van Helsing? And so using that video game as a way to introduce, like, a daughter character that would take up the mantle seemed perfect for what we were doing.
And just because the relative ages of Hugh Dancy, who was our Abraham Van Helsing, and Michael Monroe, I thought that that uncle and niece is better.
Okay.
Also,
did we not establish in that episode that it was his
No, we
daughter?
didn't establish.
Okay.
We just said that she's the last Van Helsing.
Okay.
And we also like established that at some point the Van Helsings had been involved in Prodigium, and it lined up with the idea that her grandparents. I thought that actually kind of made sense with like the sort of mentality of like the Greatest Generation being joiners, being company people.
Sure.
And then their kids grew up with James Bond movies, thinking, "Oh, we can come up with cover identities. We'll kind of do this thing." And then Adelaide, who is our age roughly, saw 9/11 happen. you know, so it's more. So she has her own way of doing it, and I thought this was a good opportunity. The other thing that was great about it being Micah Monroe is that she is already sort of typecast as a final girl. And in this story, we have Dracula playing the final girl role.
Yeah.
And so having the person chasing him in the sort of slasher movie vibe be somebody who has been like in It Follows and in The Guest, like in that role.
Well, and it's also very interesting, I think, to have a Van Helsing who is kind of an anti-hero villain who is just like killing people indiscriminately. She's like, hey, I gotta kill Dracula. I don't care who the fuck else I have to kill. Like, I'm gonna take this whole train down.
Yeah, she will kill everyone and herself to stop Dracula.
Which actually kind of puts her at odds with our Dark Legion still. Because,
yeah, I don't think that she'd be a fit.
Yeah, which is probably good because I don't think we want Van Helsing to necessarily be part, like, maybe, but
no,
that
it's
feels
kind of the problem of like for the longest time, Superman wasn't in the Justice League because he overshadowed everybody. I feel like that would be kind of like that.
Yeah, having Van Helsing as sort of a rival with like, you know, that we can throw in maybe like the Dark Legion is like, oh shit, we have to go get to this person first because if Van Helsing gets there, it's going to be a problem.
Right.
Like, we have to take care of this our way first.
But throughout this movie, I also had to keep coming up with ways to position Dracula as a protagonist and give us reasons to root for him, even though we might still hate him.
Yeah, without making us like him.
He does not give a shit about the other people on this train. He does not want to die. The way that he can not die is to stop Adelaide from crashing the train.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that. So that gives us a reason to root for him without having to make him a hero. And it also creates kind of an opportunity for a little bit of an action sequence, although I didn't want to go full action with this. I always wanted them to have a disadvantage. I'm saving the idea of him fighting for a later horror movie archetype.
Okay.
And then the real struggle for a while was figuring out the how to plot this out so that Adelaide lives, because I do want her to continue to be in the story.
Yeah, we couldn't kill her.
So then we ended up just the idea of like, well, so far as the authorities are concerned, he's just some good Samaritan.
Yeah.
But they don't want her to die. So and then we get the kind of helpless thing being like of just him just being treated like another victim, or like so many final girls in so many slasher movies, just like ends up drinking hot cocoa with a blanket over her shoulders while they take away the body of the villain or misplace the body of the villain or whatever happens. So yeah, this was my slasher riff.
So again, I don't know what happens in the rest of the movie, but already what I'm thinking with these first two stories is that we actually do need to stitch these together, because I think both of these stories work better overlapping. Like, I think the first story with Renfield is really good, but it also feels very small for this being a tentpole entry. And like I said, this being like our Dracula movie. And like the cold open starts with such a bang. And then we get this very like small scale story that feels like it kind of kills the momentum, not because it's bad, but because it's just sort of out of place, which probably makes sense why you put it first, right? Because then we can grow from there. But I think if we could just, like, at the end of the first story we don't know, do we ever find out why he was on this train? Did we find that out?
This actually is the stitching between this and chapter 3.
Okay, great. If we could start seeding that earlier, that he needs to, like, be on this train, and, like, again, I don't know why it is yet, but, like, let the stories overlap, and he's like, oh, I need to get here. Oh, but my fucking assistant is trying to kill me. And because I think this works better if it kind of feels like we talked about this in the Black Lagoon, like the noose is tightening. Like he is out of the frying pan and into the fire one after, and like making it feel more rapid fire instead of like, oh, and then we close this chapter and we start anew. It's like, no, he just survived Renfield and got out of there onto this train, and now fucking Adelaide's trying to kill him. And our through line ends up being the title Dracula Lives, despite everyone trying to fucking kill him, you know, like, and that really is, it's not really Dracula Lives so much as it's Dracula Survives. Like,
yeah, that's funny. I hadn't thought of that. That's really good.
He is trying to survive everything that is happening to him in this movie. And then I think the Renfield thing doesn't have to feel like a standalone, like it climaxes on its own. It's more of like our Act 1 stumbling block as he's getting to the next thing, which is a bigger stumbling block as he gets to the next thing.
I do think that retroactively, as we keep going through these chapters, that will happen a little bit.
Okay.
I think that once we start chapter 3, chapter 2 will feel a little bit more like it's part of this thing. I do not know if if that really sustains itself through all 5 chapters.
That's what we got to find out.
We're going to see. I'm the one thing that I am most concerned with about this is whether or not the ending feels like it is, whether or not it feels like the momentum is steady as we go, and it's not like some kind of weird drop. But I am new to writing horror.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference in how you put together a climax, I think, or how you resolve a story than when you're I don't want things to be pat.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet, right? So
yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to talk about before we go on to chapter 3?
No, I think let's actually just move right along.
Over black, we hear a woman's hushed voice.
What is it you seek? Knowledge or power?
A candle is lit. It is the only light in a hut whose shelves are brimming with arcane artifacts. The woman holding the candle is Victoire, Naomi Harris, a middle-aged woman wearing a ragged dress and a headscarf. She's looking right at us, or rather, at the man whose POV we now occupy. We hear Dracula respond. What difference is there? Does not one follow the other?
Indeed it does. To seek knowledge is to seek power, but to seek power by any other means is to seek death. Do you seek death, Count?
Yes. Victoire smiles mirthlessly. Now we get a look at who she's smiling at. It is indeed Count Dracula, but centuries ago. His hair is to his shoulders, and he wears a suit of armor. It's filthy with dried blood. I seek death, that I might kill it.
Then let us begin.
She blows out the candle. We cut to black. Chapter 3, The Sorceress. The sun sets over Rajat, capital city of the Kingdom of Morocco, in the present day. A black SUV, probably some fancy Uber, pulls up in front of a museum of antiquities. The passenger door opens and out steps a thin man in a black and red suit, preceded by a cane. It's Count Dracula, still wearing the cuts and bruises he acquired on the train from Budapest. Inside the museum, he stops at the reception desk.
Can I help you, sir?
I'm here to see the curator.
Do you have an appointment?
No, I'm an old friend.
Respectfully, sir, the curator has a lot of old friends.
Tell her that Vlad is here. I promise you, she will remember me. Skeptically, the receptionist picks up the phone and dials.
Pardon the interruption, ma'am, but there's an old friend here for you at the front desk. He says his name is Vlad.
The phone immediately clicks. She's hung up.
She definitely remembers you.
Indeed.
I think you'd best see yourself out, Mr. Vlad. The curator is...
The receptionist's phone chirps, and a voice we've heard before comes through the speaker.
Send him up.
The bemused receptionist leads Dracula through the main hall of the museum to a private office where a woman is peering through a magnifier at a centuries-old vase. When her visitor arrives, she looks up. It's Victoire, the same age she was when we saw her in the flashback. She is, however, styled very differently, wearing a practical but well-tailored pantsuit and a tasteful amount of jewelry. To her visitor, she says only,
"You look like shit."
She waves off the receptionist, and the two ancients are left alone in silence. Neither seems interested in being the first person to speak. Finally, Victoire submits.
I heard about what happened at the castle. I didn't realize you'd gotten mugged, too.
I was poisoned. And stabbed.
Serves you fucking right.
No one talks to me like that.
I do. That's what you like about me. They say you never make friends quite like you do in your youth. I've known you longer than almost anyone, which I assume is why you're here.
Dracula steps slowly and confidently around the table between them and to within a foot of Victoire's face. I need you. Victoire cracks a wry smile.
My goodness. Look at you cutting right to the climax. Things must be truly grim for you.
In mid-sentence, we cut directly to the climax, with Victoire riding on top of Dracula in bed. We witness only the final seconds of their encounter as Victoire falls forward and goes nose to nose with the Count. They share a laugh, but not a kiss. Later, Dracula wanders with his cane into the kitchen of Victoire's apartment, which is practically a museum in itself. There are artifacts all around her home that are as old as she is, and in just pristine a condition. In the kitchen, a personal chef lays a plate of fresh bread and olive oil in front of the seated Victoire. Victoire gestures for Dracula to join us. He takes a seat. The chef is about to pour him a cup of tea, and he shoots her a look that says, "Don't you fucking dare." Once the chef leaves the table, Victoire says,
You tossed and turned last night.
I'm a novice sleeper.
A surprisingly shitty liar.
Dracula doesn't dignify that with a response.
I have apocalyptic visions too, you know. You don't have to be shy about it. I know what's coming as well as you do. We'd be crazy not to have nightmares.
Once it's obvious that Dracula will not be opening up about this, Victoire pivots.
I was rooting for you, you know.
Naturally.
Oh, yes. It'd be quite the feather in my cap to be able to say I used to fuck the god of death. You know, before he was a big deal, when he was a mere vampire prince.
I was your student.
Yes, and I taught him everything he knows.
Dracula rolls his eyes. The playfulness evaporates from Victoire's voice.
Never mind the thousands of people you've ruined or murdered using the magic I taught you.
You knew who I was when you met me.
I suppose that's true. But you haven't held up your end of the bargain, and now the sword of Damocles is hanging over all of our heads. More precariously than ever, I'd wager.
Dracula breaks eye contact.
How long do you suppose we have left before the harvest, now that you've rattled your cage and awakened Farmer Brown?
I don't know. I can still sense it coming, but nothing's as clear as it was. I haven't been able to cast a proper spell since the incident. Nothing's worked. Not even a simple glamour.
As unprecedented as your situation is, that's not surprising. The entire nature of your relationship to magic has changed. It used to course through your body like blood. You were constantly absorbing it, producing it, recycling it. Now that you're human, you're going to have to reach outside of yourself if you want to manipulate it.
Is that how your magic works?
Yes. But if it were easy, everyone would do it. It took me decades to learn. I was older than I am now when I shrank my first head. You don't have that kind of time.
I must try. Victoire looks Dracula dead in the eye and rips off a mouthful of bread. More than she can chew. This woman and her fucking metaphors. That night, Dracula and Victoire sit across from each other, cross-legged, on the floor of Victoire's living room. Furniture has been pushed to the edges of the room. Victoire lights a candle in a small bronze holder and sets it between the two of them. The lighting and angles here should resemble their flashback.
Magic, like energy, is only ever borrowed. What sets it apart is that it belongs to someone, and to use it, you need their permission. As a vampire, you are gifted a sample of magic passed down from your master. Only he knows where he got it from. As for us mortals, we have two options. The first is to sweep up the crumbs that the gods and their avatars leave behind, in artifacts, in the earth itself, and learn how to make it our own, which, for you, is impractical. The other is the more direct and more dangerous approach. You can ask for it, right from the source. Make an appeal to the gods and see who answers. Beg them if necessary.
I do not beg.
We'll see.
Victoire takes a deep breath and closes her eyes. She chants an incantation, at first under her breath, then louder, then in a voice not her own. An impossible breeze kicks up dust and rattles the statuettes on the mantel. The candle flickers, and its flame grows brighter and taller like a gas burner in a chemistry lab. Victoire cries out in pain. Victoire! Victoire, stop! The candle returns to normal, and Victoire stops screaming. Her head bows low, but the rest of her body is stiff as a corpse. Dracula is about to unfold his legs and go to her when she snaps back to life. Her eyes have changed. She looks around the room, quite animated from the neck up, while otherwise remaining troublingly still. She speaks, but it's not her voice. The visitor's voice is more delicate, like a child's. This will be performed by veteran voice actor Tara Strong.
Icon.
Its playful tone only heightens its menace.
Wow, it's really you.
Who are you?
No one back home is going to believe this. Earth's most infamous vampire casts a line into the ocean, and I just happen to be the first to bite.
Tell me who you are.
Or should I say, former vampire? That's disappointing. What do you want?
I seek the power to defeat death.
Why don't you just find another vampire and get them to turn you back? Oh, right. They all hate you because you're a genocidal bastard who's killed more of your own kind than any human in history. What a pickle. Is there anyone on Earth who doesn't hate you?
Dracula says nothing. The visitor smiles with Victoire's teeth. My aim isn't to escape death. I want to defeat it, to end it forever. The visitor laughs.
Oh, is that all? I don't think you understand how this game works, or who it's for.
Then explain it to me. The visitor's voice booms, and the room's inexplicable wind picks up, lifting small objects and smashing them against the walls. The flame of the candle intensifies.
Don't tell me what to do, you little shit. I have the power here and you're going to act like it.
I will not acquiesce to a child's tantrum.
Apologize or I'll snap this bitch's neck.
Dracula glares at the visitor, but his rage melts into panic as Victoire's head starts to swivel, slowly and evenly, as if on a motor. The expression on Victoire's face remains perfectly still. Wait. Victoire's chin is now parallel to her shoulder. The rotation slows as muscle struggles against bone. I'm sorry. Please, stop. Please, forgive me. The rotation stops. After a pause, the wind dies down, and Victoire's head slowly returns to a more natural forward position.
That's better.
Dracula wipes sweat from his brow and regains control of his breathing.
Now, do you have a more reasonable request?
I want back what was taken from me.
You want to become a vampire again?
Yes. The visitor raises an eyebrow. Please.
That falls a bit outside my purview. Besides, it'd be much more fun to see you try to do it the old-fashioned way.
You know why I can't do that. Either of the remaining princes would happily sever an entire branch of their bloodline if it meant killing me.
Unless you go over their heads. To the master himself.
Impossible. No one's seen him in nearly a century.
Someone has, and recently. A long-delayed family reunion.
Dracula's eyes narrow. A hole.
Got it in one. And he's been very busy since he escaped the hole you buried him in. Rebuilding his empire with your father's blessing.
I'll never be able to get to him. Not like this.
Probably not.
Dracula thinks. Which would make any effort to reach him brief and anticlimactic.
Go on.
Dracula stands. Nameless one, I beseech you. Mend my wounds, restore my strength, and I shall repay you with a battle to satisfy the bloodlust of 100 gods. In your name. The visitor smiles.
Call me Pazuzu.
The flame of the candle becomes a blinding light. Dracula and Victoire both shield their eyes. The light returns to normal and Victoire falls backwards. Dracula reaches down and lifts her to her feet with ease, which surprises her.
I suppose that means it went well?
Not quite what I hoped. Dracula lifts his cane and grips it tightly in front of him with both hands. But it's enough. Snap! Cut to black. End of chapter 3.
Now, I know Pazuzu isn't specifically of this movie, but we don't have...
Universal spent a fuck ton of money in 2019 for the rights to make a new Exorcist trilogy.
Okay.
With Blumhouse. So it's fair game.
Wow. Okay. So... maybe this is the Pazuzu from The Exorcist.
If we decide we want to go in that direction, this is the Pazuzu from The Exorcist.
Wow.
And if we want to decide that The Exorcist, as it has existed, is part of our canon, it opens a door for us.
This is our first...
I wanted to kick open the door for you, mostly, to use Pazuzu.
This is our first canon welcoming of a non-classical... I mean, I guess you could say Brendan Fraser, but like that's a remake of a classic Universal monster. This is us taking a non-Universal classic era property and weaving it into our universe for the first time, even if very slightly.
Yes, and we do have, our own sort of cover as Pazuzu as the name of a being is not original to The Exorcist. If we don't want to, we can take it as what. But I was trying to think of who this could be, and I remembered that this would be allowed within the rules of our universe.
I love that.
I'm glad because this is much closer for you than it is for me.
We're getting so close to getting Brad Dourif into the dark universe.
It's so crazy. I mean, we're saving him for something, right? Because it's anyway.
God, we need to get.
So,
now I'm just thinking about who we're going to cast as Brad Dourif.
So, all right. So this being chapter 3, this was my ghost story, sort of like exorcism, not exorcism, our possession story, our like dark magic type story that I wanted to do.
So I like everything that's happening here. Also, a very fun character to play. I love Victoire. This is very fun. I am liking everything that has happened in all of these episodes. I maintain so far, this is not an episodic film. This is not an anthology film.
Okay.
I think it's a narrative film that maybe has an episodic structure, but I think all this stuff about him, like obviously, yes, he wants to, conquer death. He's still got the same aims as before. I think even if we don't make it explicit, we start seeding that in the first act, the first story with Renfield. And again, I think so far, if we just make Renfield and Adelaide stumbling blocks on his main quest, I think, it's sort of like a Princess Bride. I would not consider Princess Bride an anthology film.
Okay.
It is a film about one quest with an episodic structure, right? And I think that's kind of what we have here. And so far, I think it works better if we string them together more, because again, it's like the out of the frying pan into the fire nature of he's just trying to survive now. And I think that personally, I think structurally it could just be smoothed out.
Okay.
But I love everything that's happening.
I'm really glad to hear that, because this is the first one of these that I specifically, because I was struggling with it, I asked my wife, who is my first editor in a lot of things, but she does not listen to the show. I'm like, I need to redo this entire thing, and you got to tell me what you think about it. And then we ended up kind of retooling the ending together. She's really a really good editor. And that was also what she had said, because I talked about it kind of having this anthology feel to it. She's like, no, I do think this is a movie.
Yeah.
But I want to get to the end of it.
Yeah.
Because the thing that's making me feel the most like it maybe is how the final chapter works. And we're not there yet. We have 2 left. Now, this feels like a good place for us to put a pin in here, take a little break, and come back with chapter 4. But because we do have a single objective for the character that is happening through. And I do think I'm simply trying to approach it from a different angle with every episode and give everything a little bit of a different mood. No characters in the present day overlap between chapters.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the other thing. And this is potentially disappointing people. Adelaide's not going to appear again in this movie.
Yeah, I think that was clear based on her ending. And I do think if we made it narrative, we might need to change that, just for the sake of the build. But again, we'll wait and see how it all plays out. But I like the idea of approaching it from the anthology direction, again, as an episode of the podcast, as trying something different. And that's such a classic horror format. It's the kind of thing where I don't hate it as an anthology. It's just, I can so far see it being even better, actually, if it's not. But we'll see how the rest of it plays out.
All right. Well, we'll be right back after a word from one of our favorite podcasts. See you in 60 seconds.
What's up, Internet Bookworms? My name is Jason.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Bella.
And we are the hosts of the sci-fi fantasy book podcast, Shit We've Read.
What is Shit We've Read?
Well, Shit We've Read is where the 3 of us get together to talk about the shit we've just read.
But don't forget about our author conversations, too.
And we also have to mention our popular After Dark episodes, where we get a little bit steamier with our good friend Emma Skies.
That's right. So if you're a fan of science fiction and fantasy,
or if you just love a good book discussion,
then you're in the right place.
Shit We've Read is available to listen to now wherever you get your podcasts or at shitwe'veread.com.
So follow us on social media at Shit We've Read for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and to join the discussion.
And happy listening.
We cut from black directly to a close-up on a pair of furious eyes. This is Ahul, who we saw by Dracula's side in the film's opening flashback, now dressed in a torn and bloodied general's uniform. We pull back to see that he's on his knees with his arms pulled out to his sides on ropes. On either side, a half-dozen men struggle to keep him restrained. He roars and pulls against their weight, and one of the men stumbles, giving Ahul the slightest amount of give on his right arm. Before Ahul can put this opportunity to use, a sword is pressed to his throat. On the other end of this sword stands Dracula, wearing a flowing black and red cape. Like Ahul, his irises are tinged with red, and his incisors come to sharp, pronounced points beneath his devious smile. Ahul stops struggling against the ropes, but his eyes still look like they're struggling to remain inside his head.
I always knew you were a snake, brother.
Did you now? Pity you didn't do anything about it while you still could. Now I'm afraid you're out of options. Ahul looks past Dracula and sees a group of men, his men, being marched down the moonlit beach at gunpoint. This is Banda Bazaar, an island in what is now called Indonesia. The year is 1621, and the island is under siege by the Dutch East India Company.
Father will kill you for this.
For what? For increasing his fortune 100-fold. The master may have a soft spot for his children, Ahul, but he prizes nothing above power. He can no longer afford to indulge your sympathy for the local cattle.
These are my people.
Dracula crouches down next to Ahul and scoops up a handful of wet earth between them. Yes, they are. Just as this is your dirt crawling with your worms and your insects. They are all yours, and they are all beneath you, beneath us. And yet you side with them against your own kind, against your peers and your betters.
The Dutch East India Company will rape this island, steal its goods, enslave its people.
Yes, for the greater good of our empire, they will. I'm surprised at you, Ahul. You'll feed on your countrymen's blood, but not their labor.
My servants offer themselves freely. I take only what I need to keep my kingdom strong.
Then, evidently, you have not taken enough. We see a raging fire engulf the nearby village, including Ahul's palace. Humans and vampires alike run from the blaze. Ahul can only watch and shudders with pain as one of his vampire underlings crumbles to ash. You feel it, don't you? You can feel your ranks thinning. How many children do you suppose you have left, Ahul?
Why not just kill me and be rid of all of them?
I'm afraid that's beyond my mandate. The master doesn't want you killed, only punished. You're to be imprisoned until such time as you regain your sanity and reaffirm your loyalty to our house.
Then you'd be wise to take my head right here and now. You could cage me forever, starve me of blood, singe my skin with rays of daylight until the sun goes dark, and it would change nothing. I will kill you, brother. You and everyone who follows you. There will be no mercy.
Dracula pauses, then shrugs. Forever it is, then. He gestures to his guards, who begin dragging Ahul by his restraints towards a windowless carriage. Ahul struggles, but fails to overpower the dozen vampire sentries. As we pull back to a wide shot of the scoured island, we hear Ahul's rageful screams.
Brother, you will burn for this! I swear it! I will kill you! Dracula!
Cut to black. Faded on a karambit blade, a small claw-shaped dagger with a hole for the user's thumb, as seen in the Raid movies. And it's inside a glass display case. An Indonesian shopkeeper, Sesep, played by Yaya Ruhan, was one of the actors from the Raid. He's usually partnered. He's also in John Wick Chapter 3. The other guy who he's usually fighting alongside is an actor named Sesep, so I named him after him.
Totally.
Sesep walks the customer, whose face we don't see, through what appears to be a very swanky store for collectors of bladed weapons. He speaks to his customer in Indonesian, subtitled for us.
This is a karambit. Perfect if you're looking for a souvenir. They're all the rage in martial arts films right now.
Is it practical in combat? Sesep is impressed by the question. He has misjudged his customer.
In close quarters and in the hands of a Penchak Salat master, it can be quite devastating, but I wouldn't recommend bringing it to a fight without training, especially around here where you're more likely to run into someone who knows how to use one.
The shopkeeper walks the customer further to the next case over, which houses a thin, foot-long blade resembling a machete.
You might be better off with a golok. It's light and fast, but it's heavy enough to take someone's hand.
I want something with a longer reach.
Let me show you some of my big-ticket items.
The shopkeeper walks the customer into another room, whose walls are lined with a variety of swords. He shows the customer a long, wavy blade with a slightly curved handle.
This is a sundong from Sulawesi.
Does its wavy shape serve a purpose, or is it a local affectation?
The waves make it easier to pull the blade free when it becomes embedded in an enemy's bones.
May I?
Be my guest.
The customer retrieves the blade off the wall. Only now do we see, though you've surely suspected, that the man shopping for weapons is Dracula. He checks the sword's weight and balance, swings it in the air once. Sesep crosses his arms and grins, but his face freezes when, thunk! The sundang lodges in his skull, cutting 2/3 of the way through his head. Dracula pauses, and then in a swift sweeping motion, pulls the blade out of the shopkeeper's skull and chops his head off at the neck before the body can hit the floor. Seems you're right. Sesep's head rolls by as Dracula leans the sword over his shoulder and makes for the exit. Chapter 4. The Sword. This, by the way, if I were not going to have one director do all of them, this is the one where Timo Tayangto was going to direct it. Like, this is...
I can already tell from all the references to the Raid.
This would have been the entire movie in the original draft, and that scene with Ahul on the beach was originally the first scene of the film.
Okay.
It's a rainy night in the sinking city of Jakarta, Indonesia. Once the capital of the island chain nation, Jakarta is now living on borrowed time, a casualty of the rising sea level. The young people who live here, many of whom have nowhere else to go and have no money to get there if they did, seek escape in wild, drug-fueled parties. And folks, it's a Friday. In a packed nightclub, 100 men and women rave to pulsing electronic music. Lasers and strobe lights reflect off of a mist that could be either a smoke machine or just the humidity of human sweat. We crane up from the crowd to see the VIP balcony above, where a tall man stands at the railing, peering down. No, peering's the wrong word. He's hunting. Ahul's red eyes scan the assembled 20-somethings like a restaurant menu. He stops when he sees a young woman he likes, Dion, dancing freely and furiously with a gang of friends. He speaks, softly enough that no one in this pounding club could possibly hear. You. The woman looks up, and their eyes meet. She's heard his voice in her head. Her dancing stops, and she starts making her way across the club towards the foot of the stairs to the VIP section. She arrives at a bouncer who looks up at Ahul. Ahul nods, and he lets her through. She arrives and stands before Ahul's table. He sits, flanked by two leather-clad gangsters. This scene continues in subtitled Indonesian.
What's your name?
Dion.
Do you know who I am?
Yes.
Then you know why you're here.
Dion is compelled to answer, but her voice breaks from fear. Yes.
That's good. Sit down, have a drink.
Dion sits down in Ahul's booth and takes a sip from a champagne glass in front of her. A tear rolls down her cheek.
Tell me about yourself.
I'm a student at the university. I have two sisters. One of them is downstairs. She's probably wondering where I am. She's always been there for me. I love her so much.
Should I have her join us?
No. Please, no.
Relax.
Enthralled, she struggles to obey this impossible command.
I'd never do such a thing. It's important to me that you understand I'm not a greedy man. I don't take more than I need.
Ahul traces along Dion's neck with his fingernail. Her breath quickens.
This city needs me, and tonight I need you. That makes you important. You're a very important person, Dion.
Ahul turns Dion towards him, leans her over, and kisses her neck.
Say it back to me.
He opens his mouth, and his teeth extend to long points. I'm very important. Ahul's about to take a bite when he and everyone else is startled by the fire alarm. The overhead sprinkler system kicks in. It's just water, by the way. I'm not going to completely crib from Blade. Just a little bit. Some of the club goers below scream in annoyance. Others in delight. Those who don't think dancing in the indoor rain is a hoot make for the exits until the dance floor is at about 1/3 capacity. Ahul leaves Dion paralyzed in her seat and stands at the railing to see a few dozen dancers wilding out under the sprinklers, and one middle-aged white man standing totally still holding a sword, looking up at him with a smug smile.
Dracula.
Ahul's two bodyguards rise to their feet. Without taking his eyes off Dracula, Ahul commands them.
Kill him.
The two gangsters behind Ahul each transform into a ferocious black wolf and dive off the edge of the balcony at Dracula, who swipes his sword and slashes as they land, drawing blood from both. They fall back and recover onto their paws before pouncing again in unison. The remaining dancers now scatter. One of the wolves locks his jaws around Dracula's left wrist, his sword arm, while the other goes for his face. Dracula manages to get his other forearm up to keep his nose from getting bit off, but then heaves his weight so that the wrist wolf's momentum feeds a back kick to his forward opponent. Dracula reaches across his body and digs the fingers of his right hand into the eyes of the wolf attacking his left. The wolf releases his bite and morphs into a bat, fluttering up into the air, only to change back into human form and drop down foot first, grazing Dracula's chin. Summoned by Ahul, more vampire gangsters arrive in waves. We're now treated to a dizzying fight sequence in which Dracula tries to fend off dozens of vampires who are continually shifting between human, bat, and wolf forms. This must be as bloody and violent as Dracula promised Pazuzu it would be. It's a trial, but the nondescript henchmen never quite have the upper hand over the ageless warrior, and the fight ends with Dracula cleaving the wolf head off of his final opponent and holding it up for Ahul to see. It gradually transforms back into a human head, and Dracula drops it on the floor. The scene continues in English.
That wasn't what I expected.
Then you're a fool. I was slaughtering warriors by the dozen when I was still only a man.
And what are you now, brother? Or should I even call you that anymore, now that we no longer share any blood?
Honestly, Ahul, I couldn't possibly give a shit.
Of course you couldn't. You never treated me like family in the first place. I was only ever your shadow. And when I went off to start my own life, to build my own legacy, you burned down my kingdom and buried me in a cell for 400 years. And do you know what happened while I was gone? Exactly what I said would happen. My country was plundered, along with the rest of this planet, and now Jakarta is sinking into the sea. The rest of your brothers are dead, half of them by your hand, and thanks to your arrogance, vampires are now an endangered species.
And you think things would have gone differently under your rule?
We'll never know, will we? I can try to turn things around, but there isn't much time left now.
Do you intend to stand up there and lecture me until I grow old and die, or are you going to come down here and settle this? Ahul sighs. Dion is still sitting perfectly still at the table, but now in a puddle of her own urine.
You arrived in the middle of dinner.
We cut to a few minutes later. Dracula sits at the table opposite Ahul, who is taking his time draining blood from Dion's neck. She's not quite dead, but she's not really here anymore either. This grisly scene couldn't be more mundane to the two men. Ahul comes up for air.
Why are you really here, Vlad?
How do you know I'm not here just to kill you?
Because killing me doesn't get you anything. You are cruel, heartless, and rapacious beyond measure, but you are not petty. You came here for something.
Dracula doesn't enjoy being perceived so accurately. He says nothing.
So, I can only conclude that you imagined you would challenge me in combat, and once you had me at your mercy, you would make some sort of demand in exchange for sparing my life. Then, after I'd given it to you, again, purely in your wild imaginings, you'd more than likely kill me anyway. Is that about right?
Dracula grits his teeth.
So, what is it that you want?
I'm looking for our father.
My father, you mean. Whatever could he want with you now that you're...
Ahul pats his hand against his own chest, mimicking a heartbeat. He laughs at his own joke.
But that's just it, isn't it? You're looking for a way back in.
It doesn't concern you. Ahul takes one final drag of blood from Dion's neck and lets her lifeless body fall limp. He leans across the table and gets right in Dracula's face, Dion's blood on his chin and on his breath.
I should turn you myself, right now. It would be so much sweeter than killing you to tie your fate to my own. Make you my son.
Dracula rises in a flash and pulls his sword from underneath the table, slicing it in half on the upswing. Ahul leaps into the air, unnaturally high, and kicks the sword from Dracula's hand, and it twirls overhead down to the club below. They dive at each other, tumbling over the edge of the balcony onto the soggy dance floor. This fight is hand-to-hand, but somehow more brutal than the first one. Ahul is a devastating fighter, a practitioner of full-body penchak salat. Even restored to peak human fitness, Dracula is not a match for him. The Count is unyielding, but Ahul finally catches his right arm, locks it between his own, and wrenches his elbow hard in the wrong direction. Dracula's howls of pain almost drown out the sound of crunching bone. Almost. Ahul releases Dracula's arm and he falls to his knees. Ahul gets down on his haunches next to him, like a parent lowering himself to his child's level.
I don't know very much about modern medicine, but that injury looks quite permanent. Of course, if I were to feed you my blood and drink a bit of yours in exchange, you could be in shape for round 2 inside of an hour. But then, of course, you could never kill me. You would be sworn to my service, to my empire, for all eternity.
Dracula seethes and holds back another scream as what remains of his elbow throbs in pain. In the corner of his eye, he sees his sword lying on the floor, handle pointed towards him, maybe 6 feet to his left. He lunges for it, but Ahul, who is far faster, grabs him by his right wrist. All of Dracula's desperate momentum yanks against his crooked elbow. The pain is unimaginable.
Just say the word, Vlad. I can end your pain and restore our family. We can set everything right.
That's your problem, brother. Dracula heaves hard against Ahul's grip, screaming as the lower and upper halves of his arm grow further and further apart, stretching and tearing skin and ligaments until... rip. Dracula dives for the sword, rolls on his shoulder, and swipes the sword laterally at his enemy. You can't be half a monster. Ahul looks in shock at Dracula, then at the dismembered arm in his own clutches, then at the growing stripe of blood across his abdomen. A long second later, Ahul falls over, bisected at the waist.
Yeah!
Dracula staggers and drops his sword, clutching his bleeding stump with his remaining hand. He walks slowly to where the top half of Ahul is lying face up, astonished. Dracula takes a knee, which he plants directly onto Ahul's chest. Where is he? The vampire coughs, laughs a little.
You poor bastard. All this blood, all that it's cost you. And you might have even found him on your own if you'd only bothered to look.
Where? Ahul smiles.
He's gone home. To the mountain. To the place where you first met.
Dracula scowls and strains as he rises to his feet. He walks a few paces away from Ahul and picks up his sword.
Not that it matters. He's seen it too, more clearly than either of us. We'll all be together again soon enough.
Dracula raises his blade over Ahul's neck and plunges it down with all of his weight. End of chapter 4.
I have one little quibble here.
Hit me.
Don't we have to kill him like a vampire?
Oh, he's been beheaded.
Oh, okay. I guess, yeah, that is a way to kill a vampire.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Wow, we got an armless Dracula.
Yeah, he lost the arm.
I like that. I like fucking up a main character.
I think it's important. Like, one of the things that annoys me about Infinity Wars when they give Thor his eye back. I think they should never have done that. I think it's also, there's an important thing that I think of with making this movie, which is I think that when we talk about being additive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that when it comes to our Dark Legion movies, we have to follow a degree of WrestleMania continuity. And I think you know what that means, but for those in the audience who don't, WrestleManias are sort of structured in such a way, their stories are built in such a way, at least the main event scene, that if you only watch WrestleMania each year, the fact that you haven't seen the intervening 11 months of pay-per-views should not be completely disorienting for you. Stuff that is set up at one WrestleMania that isn't paid off until the final WrestleMania, even though all of those characters have had stories in the intervening year. I think it's really important to add shit that has happened to the characters between Dark Legion movies without undoing anything that happens between Dark Legion movies.
Right.
So I really wanted to have him be different when we found him.
Okay.
In a way that pushes what has happened to him in the last movie forward. Now, I may have just given away a little bit how this story ends. But yeah, so this was in my head. I wanted to do kind of a Timo Tollanto's Blade type movie. But as much as that would have been fun, I really wanted to honor the challenge that you gave me and to make something more like a Dracula movie. So my compromise was that became one of the 5 tones of this film.
I like it. I really love this battle. I also love that they're both so despicable. And because the thing is, like, with that flashback, you would the worry is that the audience would start to root for Ahul, right? But then you make Ahul so gross and despicable with this woman that you're like, oh no, they both suck.
Yeah, because here's the I think of Ahul as somebody who as like one of the sort of like good billionaires who thinks that he's so much different, but is in fact just like good at particular virtue signals. He's still a fucking vampire, right? So even when he says, "Oh, my people give me their blood willingly" or whatever, like probably not, man. You glamour people. You tell people what you want from them, and then they give it to you.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of him being a sort of self-righteous vampire who's like, you know, I'm vegan, but I cheat on Fridays. It's like, no, if you're going to be vegan.
Which
like,
kind of in a perverse way
vegan.
Makes you root for Dracula, right?
Yeah,
even though we don't like Dracula, his like line about like, you can't be half a monster, like that is kind of a cheer line because you're like, hey, fuck you for like pretending to be good and stuff. Like Dracula knows who he is. Yeah. He knows he's a bad son of a bitch. And,
trying to find more angles by which Dracula can be preferable to other characters.
Yes,
right?
And I think that works here. Yeah.
Like in chapter 3, we introduce a character who's maybe the only person who actually likes Dracula and who seems to like back. And then we introduce a character who's willing to kill her, right? Which makes that character immediately the antagonist.
Yeah.
And Dracula has to actually be protective over somebody, and that gives him a little bit of sympathy.
Yeah.
But we never want to make him too sympathetic, which is why chapter 4 begins with him taking part in big time imperialism and colonialism, and then murdering a perfectly decent guy who sells swords because for him it's fun to do.
Yeah.
But then you get Ahul, by the way, who I've named after an obscure Indonesian cryptid that is like a giant bat.
Oh, cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, I feel like I'm glad that worked. Because it's a little bit manipulative, but these are all sort of short stories, and I have to do everything kind of fast.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely working that you're continually getting us on Dracula's side without making us like him. And that's a very tricky line to walk. I continue to have a lot of structure thoughts, but we're so close to the end, I'm going to save them until we see how everything resolves.
And here's what I think is maybe my most abrupt segue. And my biggest radical tone shift, and is the biggest reason why I have my doubts as to whether or not this plays through as it is as one continuous film.
I am excited to see what happens.
But I have added one very, very direct visual segue in order to kind of try and ease that transition. So Dracula has just plunged his blade into Ahul's neck. A man in bloodstained armor pulls the tip of his broadsword up from the body of a felled enemy soldier, then whirls around to defend himself from attack. 2 armies clash under the sun at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains, the year 1442. The man we've been following, his face obscured by wet chin-length hair, becomes overwhelmed by his attacker. He's knocked off of his feet and is about to suffer a killing blow when his enemy's head is swiftly lopped off from his shoulders by a mounted swordsman. We now follow the cavalryman as he rides his way into the mass of battle, dispatching enemies with skill and ferocity. This is Prince Vlad Dracula, portrayed by Mads Mikkelsen, the same age as we're accustomed to seeing his Dracula. Vlad's forces rally around him, and we can sense the momentum of the battle shift in their favor. Next, we witness Vlad mounting one of his foe's bodies on a pike at the foot of the mountain. There are nearly 100 impaled men around him, some of them still squirming. But there are nearly as many bodies on the ground around them, wearing armor similar to Vlad's. Only about 24 of his men still live. One of them, a boy of about 15, approaches him, head bowed. They speak in subtitled Romanian.
The cost was great, but you have led us to victory yet again, Prince Vlad.
Vlad surveys the scene. No cost is too high for victory, but I fear we lack the numbers to survive the Turks' next attack. We need more men.
Then we shall see to it, sire. Though it may require lowering the age of conscription again.
Vlad looks back at the teenager in front of him. His eyes do not convey confidence. Then he looks past him, up to the mountain, then back at the boy. See to it. Take whoever is fit to travel back to the citadel. I am placing you in command until I return.
Yes, my lord. Are you not coming with us?
I have business atop the mountain.
My lord, whatever power resides there is unreachable. Many men have sought it out. The few who have returned have come back mad.
Then for your sake, young squire, pray that I return with your salvation or not at all. With that, Vlad turns to face the imposing mountain and begins his fateful climb. Chapter 5. The Summit.
I do want to say I really like the interstitials all being flashbacks to different points in Dracula's life and kind of mixing up the order of it all. I think it works really well. It's the kind of thing where, like, again, I think you're fulfilling the promise of the premise. We're learning more about Dracula. We're learning about his history. And we're not doing the Dracula Untold thing where it's like we're spending a whole fucking movie in the Carpathian Mountains with him as a soldier becoming Dracula. We can glean that through these little snapshots and get enough. And
but I have taken direct influence from Dracula Untold here in when I set the story and the idea of him finding this guy in the mountains that is going to make... But I want to be very clear, even though there will be indications at some point here that I am integrating Dracula Untold into the canon. I thought about it. I'm not doing it.
Yeah, Dracula Untold is not canon.
It's not canon in our universe. If they had wanted it to be canon, they wouldn't have stripped it of. They would have made that the first Dark Universe release like it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
But no, it's not in our canon. I almost did it just to fuck with you. But I watched a couple of key scenes again. I'm like, it's just not compatible. I just can't do it.
I do think, like, obviously in our current streaming era, like, we would, of course, they would order a dozen Peacock shows of like, all right, now we're going to do 3 seasons of young Dracula, you know? And I kind of, I hate that impulse, and I like it much better doing it this way. I don't personally ever want us to make a Dark Universe movie about young Dracula.
No. And
I
I'm
like
thinking
just
that
getting these glimpses and the important scenes as they make the present more important, right?
And I'm hoping that the way that I've done this will preclude the need to ever do that.
Good.
We're filling in the backstory in small snippets as they relate to what's happening now.
But we encourage our listeners to make all the fan fiction they want about Mads Mikkelsen Dracula's early years.
Chapter 5. The Summit. We fade in from black to a bone-white sky. It's a winter's day in the Carpathian Mountains, and there's a flurry of snow drifting through the air. A man in a heavy coat and climbing gear trudges up the steep mountainside. The layer of snow beneath his feet is thin for now, but it won't be for long. He stops and takes a seat on a rock, and we get a closer look at him. The coat's right arm has been removed and sewn shut at the shoulder. The man retrieves a thermos of water from his bag and lifts it to his chapped lips. It's Dracula, of course, with determination in his eyes. He looks up to the top of the mountain. He's got a long way to go. The sun is setting behind the mountain, leaving Dracula, a bit further up the mountain now, immersed in shadow. A responsible climber would probably make camp about now, but Dracula is too stubborn, too accustomed to his own supernatural durability to consider such a thing. He makes a single compromise with himself. He turns on his flashlight. Not that it's doing much good. The snow is coming down harder now, and the flashlight's beam only reaches about 5 feet ahead. It doesn't matter. Up he goes. Finally, in the dead of night, Dracula is forced to acknowledge his own fatigue. He sets up the tent that he's had collapsed in his pack and crawls inside to sleep. He rises at daybreak, stepping out of his tent to an unfamiliar setting. It was so dark when he made camp, he really had no idea where he was at the time. He's brought a dozen eggs with him, so he fries 2 of them up on a hot plate, then packs up and continues the climb. His footprints from last night are almost entirely filled in by fresh snow, but he picks up right where they left off. Around midday, Dracula stops walking and kneels down to find something strange. A second set of shallow, snow-filled footprints along the very path he's been walking, only ahead of him. What are the odds of someone else coming the same way? With no other obvious options, Dracula follows the trail. Hours pass, and as he rises over a ridge, Dracula can see another man climbing in the distance. The sun is reflecting harshly off of the snow, and he can't make out any details, but his displeasure at having company or witnesses is obvious. A gust of wind kicks snow into Dracula's eyes, and he loses sight of the stranger. At dusk, the snowstorm returns with a vengeance, forcing the frustrated Dracula to once again take shelter for the night. He is awakened by visions of the burning door, and when he steps out of his tent in the morning, his surroundings look just as they did when he woke up the previous morning. This time, there are half-filled-in footprints both behind and in front of his tent. That afternoon, as the storm picks up, he stumbles forward and catches himself with his left hand, the only one he has. The snow is a good 8 inches deep here, and his arm has made a noticeable indentation. But when Dracula looks down, he sees that there's another one right beside it, where his right arm would have landed if he still had it. He rises with a start and searches the nearby woods from his position. "What is this? Who's there?" His voice echoes back to him faintly, reflected off the rock face. Probably. The next morning, Dracula emerges from his tent looking grizzled and unkempt, fries 3 eggs, and packs up to continue his climb. At midday, Dracula looks ahead of him and sees a stranger in the distance. This time, the stranger looks back. The light glints off the stranger's body like he's wearing something metal. The stranger waves with his right arm. If he has a left arm, we don't see it. Dracula waves back. They both continue hiking. It's morning again. Dracula, with a full beard, opens a full carton of eggs and fries 4 of them on a hot plate before continuing up the mountain. It's morning again. Dracula opens a full carton of eggs and laughs. He gets up and starts throwing them one by one against a nearby tree. His laugh becomes more unhinged as he destroys the entire dozen. It's morning again. Dracula calmly opens a full carton of eggs and fries 2 of them on a hot plate before continuing up the mountain. Later, at the ridge, Dracula catches another glimpse at his climbing companion. This time, Dracula waves first. The stranger waves back. "Hello!" Dracula receives only his echo in return. The stranger turns around and continues hiking. "Wait! Wait for me!" Dracula hurries up the hill, trying to keep the stranger in view, but he never seems to get any closer. The glint of sunlight off his armor disappears as the sun hides behind a cloud, and the snowstorm resumes. It's morning again. Dracula lies awake in his tent, staring up at the ceiling. The storm picks up and buffets the tent. He doesn't move an inch. Night falls. It's morning again. Dracula cracks an egg against the edge of his water thermos and drops the yolk inside with a half-dozen others. He guzzles it down, runny egg dripping down his chin. That night, he powers through the snowstorm, this time not stopping for anything. It's falling more heavily than we've ever seen it, until he's trudging through waist-high snow. It seems to get taller as he pushes forward, as if he's walking down a slope while the snow plane stays perfectly flat above. He keeps pushing until his head falls out of view. The white of the snow dissolves into the white of the sky as a raggedy, bearded, shaggy-haired Dracula lifts himself up onto a stone plateau. Before him is the jagged mouth of a deep cave. He's made it at last. He drops his climbing pack and wanders inside. His eyes are wild and bloodshot. As he traverses the cave, which seems to wind and weave endlessly, he begins to hear echoing voices that are first too distorted to decipher, but gradually become more clear.
My strength will be your own. You shall be bound to me and my power until the last days of the earth. Your service is eternal and without condition.
I understand, Master.
Then die now, and be reborn a child of hell.
We hear a scream and the sound of teeth gnashing into wet flesh, and Dracula breaks into a run. Soon, the tunnel he's been wandering finally opens up into a vast empty cavern. Empty, except for the colony of bats covering every square inch of the ceiling. A voice from behind Dracula startles him.
I was wrong then.
Dracula whirls around and sees the Master, a thin white man in his 70s wearing a simple, timeless black suit and played by Charles Dance, standing behind him, back the way he came in.
We are all the children of hell.
Dracula is now clean-shaven, his hair at the length he was when he started his climb. His body may be as it was, but the journey's toll on his mind is still apparent on his face. Father, I
am not your father!
The Master's voice booms through the cave, prompting its resident bats to swarm out of the chamber.
You are my son no longer, and you never shall be again.
Dracula struggles to speak in response. I sought only to strengthen your empire, Master.
You sought to strengthen yourself, to ascend to the throne of death, but it would not have you. And now, death will have all of us.
I would have saved us all.
You must think me a fool. For centuries, I watched you undermine your sister and brothers in the name of strengthening my empire. And it amused me for a time, the way you all competed for my favor. There was great sport in it, and great profit. But eventually you decided that it wasn't enough to play the game. Someone had to win it.
And why not? If I am forced to play, why not play to win?
Because in order to declare a winner, the game must end.
The master's scowl quivers a bit. It is not only rage in his voice, but grief. The master steps aside, and behind him, where there was once nothing, there is now a wooden door in a freestanding frame. Dracula inhales sharply. Dracula looks to the master, who nods. Dracula hesitates for a moment, then steps towards the door. He reaches for the key around his neck, the one from the dream, but it's not there. It's already in the lock. Dracula grips the handle and slowly turns it, pulls it, and as it opens, he is bathed in red-orange light. The deep roar of the raging inferno echoes through the cavern. We do not see what's on the other side of the door. We only see Dracula's eyes widen and glisten with tears. He chokes back a sob, which escalates into a wail and then a full-throated scream. He keeps screaming, unable to stop for long enough to take a deep breath. Behind him, the master turns away and wanders the darkness of the cave. He mutters to himself.
You were never my favorite.
In an extreme close-up, we hold on Dracula's face as tears evaporate off his eyes and his skin begins to sizzle and peel. We hear the sound of an egg frying on a hot plate. Some unseen beast takes a deep, deep breath. Cut to black. And that's the end of the movie.
Are there any post-credit scenes?
No.
Wow. First movie with no post-credit scenes.
Well, because the thing is, and you can tell me if I've overcorrected here, because I think that's possible.
Okay.
The biggest thing that keeps me from being able to write an effective horror story is my desire to clarify shit and have it all make sense. And this chapter was my In the Mouth of Madness chapter.
Okay.
Which I think the main problem with that, if there is one, is that it's the last one. Because I wanted to be expressionistic here.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make choices that I could intellectualize and explain and then not explain them.
Okay.
And I wanted to leave Dracula at the lowest point that he will be in the film, because often in a horror story, that's how it ends.
Yeah.
I don't want to resolve it. And we also, though, have the cop-out that there will be future chapters in this story where we can resolve. We're going to find out what happens to Dracula, right? We're going to find out what's behind the door.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to do it right now. What I want to do is have him just terrified by the fact that there's no escape from his mortality and that everything that he's done has made things worse.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also no guarantee that this is even real.
That's right.
Yeah, this could be a hallucination. This could be him going mad. You know, like there's one world in which we follow up on this and Dracula's in hell. He has died and he is in hell. There's a version where we follow up on this where he is sitting alone in the mountains, crazy. There is a world in which we do neither of those and find him in some maybe in between those two things. I think I like that.
Okay.
But I think this actually feeds into my theory on the structure of this.
Tell me about it.
I actually think the structure is going to what elevates this and makes this work. Right now, we are floating between anthology and episodic narrative movie because the acts 3 through 5 are one story, right? He goes to Victoire. He says, I want to rule death. Bar that, I want to at least be a vampire again. That leads him to Ahul, which leads him to the master, right? This is all connected. That's one narrative. The opening segment doesn't have to do with any of that. The opening segment is more kind of like a little mini epilogue to House of Dracula.
Right, where he's learning about being human and being vulnerable and getting some comeuppance for the life that he lived.
And then the second one is kind of a transition thing where, yes, he's on the train to go to Victoire, but it's really more about Adelaide, and we don't know what he's doing yet, right?
Right. Those two chapters are both about what's behind him and what's hunting him because of what he's done.
And those
they sort of all are, but I can tell, I know what you mean by the fact that they feel a little bit separated.
Well, yeah, and But I think it's pretty easy to make this all thematically click, which is that, again, I think we open on the dream because Dracula, as we learn in House of Dracula, Dark Legion, he is afraid of death. He is afraid of what's on the door, on the other side of the door, right? And so I think we just need to make his motivations a little clearer throughout, where I think when we find him, he's having this nightmare and he is more, instead of being kind of like, you know, I think he is still kind of depressed and sitting around, but I think he needs to be more like, my work isn't done. And now I'm mortal and my work is more important than ever. I really need to figure out this death thing, but he's too weak, right? Because he's being poisoned. And he's like, I need to leave this castle, but I can't. My limbs aren't working. I'm vomiting. I can't keep food down. But I'm trapped in this mortal body. And then when he finds out Renfield's plan and kills Renfield, he's like, oh my God, I just got so close to dying. I need to get out of here. And that ends with him fleeing the castle into the sunlight for the first time because he needs to go take care of this problem. And maybe his plan right at first is to like go right to the source. Maybe he's going to Prodigium to get the Osiris stuff back, or he's going straight to the master or something. And then Adelaide attacks and he realizes, no, I'm too weak. Like, I cannot face the forces that are against me. And so he pivots his plan and says, I need to go to Victoire. I need to be given a gift because I cannot do what I need to do right now with this strength. And that drives him there, which then gives him the power of Pazuzu to rejuvenate his
and
body.
The rest of it can play as it does. And so really, the chapters as they exist can remain. They just need a little bit more of that connective tissue.
Because then the ending works so much better because the whole movie has been about Dracula surviving. As I said in the previous thing, like the thing is that Dracula is more scared than ever because now he is mortal and it's not just about living, it's about avoiding what he's always been trying to avoid. And that makes this ending scene, we open on the dream, we end with the door. He has been terrified and now this is his worst nightmare, not from the middle chapter, but his worst nightmare from the very first moment of the film realized. And so I think if we connect these and make them overlap and make each of these things a motivating factor that takes him to this door at the end, that ending works better. And I think it already works, but I think it's the anthology aspect of it is maybe holding it back, where if we just bite the bullet and make it an episodic narrative thing, then it all flows together. It all brings us to this inevitable endpoint.
Right. And that
works.
My chapter markers can still kind of cover for the radical sort of slight genre shifts throughout.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think like the way it's split up, especially for the podcast, is perfect because it is episodic, but that first act ends and it's kind of like, okay, but what happened that I need to care about?
Right.
And like this seems very small. I don't understand like sort of what we're building to. And the thing is we are building to something, right?
Yeah, but we need to make that feel like it's an on-ramp to something rather than something that has a button on the end of it.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, that all sounds perfect, great to me. I'm glad that it works as well as it does, to be honest. Like I think talked about this earlier. This was the hardest one to write so far on the show. And that like includes like Dark Legion, House of Dracula was comparably easy because we were tag teaming together. And like, I can write goofy comedy and musical numbers all fucking day. But like it was outside my wheelhouse. And this was fucking hard. So I'm really glad that it works as well as it does, and that there's only like we just need more of it.
Yeah, the thing I think to put it another way, like the madness of the ending, right? This Lovecraftian moment, this opening of the door, the breathing of the beast. It works so much better if the descent into madness doesn't start in Act 5, it starts in Act 1.
Okay.
Like Renfield trying to kill him makes him mad. Not mad angry, but like it starts because he got so close to the door again and it drives him a little crazy. And then Adelaide almost killing him on the train drives him a little crazier and he's getting more desperate. He's getting more afraid. And so it's really like the whole movie is a car crash, a slow motion car crash where you're watching him fulfill his inevitable destiny by the way he loses. The Dracula who we've known in Dark Legion to be calm and in control is no longer in control. He is now behind the wheel of a car with no brakes, and he needs to find a way off of it.
The struggle with chapter 5 was that I left him in a place where he was relatively confident. And I needed to strip that away from him and not have it feel like it happens overnight.
Yeah, I think he goes a little crazy in Act 1. He goes a little crazy in Act 2 with Adelaide. The experience with Victoire shakes him. I think if there's and maybe we don't figure out this out right now, but I think if Act 4 just leaves him in a place where I think he can still have the victory over Ahul, but we can see that there has been a toll taken on him.
Right. I mean, he's lost his arm.
He's lost his arm, but like also like mentally, like he, instead of being calm and collected, he needs to be like, oh, he's on the edge of something that he is not in control of right now. And then that ending ends up working, I think, even better than it does. And I think ending it on this sort of bizarre mind trip kind of thing reminds me of the end of Doctor Strange, which I like. I really like that end of the Doctor Strange movie where he's going up again. It's not like a big fight scene.
Right.
It is this sort of trippy, outsmarting battle of wits thing.
Cool.
And this is... Yeah, this is kind of what this is, where there's no big climactic battle with Adelaide, you know. It is a climax it's an emotional climax told through this sort of dissolving insanity, which I think can work. We just need to be seeding it from that very first dream sequence right out of the title card.
Great. Agreed.
Yeah.
And yeah, just because we kind of glossed over a lot of the little casting things here. Charles Dance playing the vampire that makes Dracula a vampire is my Judi Dench or J.K. Simmons thing. It's
now,
like...
Remind me who Charles Dance is.
Charles Dance is known for Game of Thrones. I think he's Tywin Lannister.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, I know who that is. That's a great, that's
and
great
he's
casting.
and he's in Last Action Hero.
I was thinking
he's like a great menacing Brit. And in Dracula Untold, he is like, it's like the one really good scene in the movie where Dracula faces the character that for our intents and purposes as a viewer is Dracula.
Oh, so it's the same
It's the same character and the same actor, but it's not the same continuity. And they both use the framework of talking about something as what's happening as a game. Because I liked it, just happened to fit with what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And there's stuff that you and I have talked about a little bit that I push forward very, very vaguely about the grander scheme of our story.
Yes.
That hopefully is going to get people intrigued, and I haven't given away too much. Or
I do want to say that you said Charles Dance. I've been thinking in my head of Bill Dance, who is the person who does like the public access fishing show and is always like falling into the water. And there's a bunch of like blooper compilations on YouTube. I think his name is Bill Dance, but I figured that's not who you were referring to.
No, this is this is British actor Charles Dance. I
like that we've sort of rehabilitated Dracula Untold. Not that movie, but we've taken stuff that works and worked it into our narrative.
Well, I mean, we already saved The Mummy, right?
Of course.
Mission accomplished on that one. Yes. That movie's good
so now. We have to do the other Dark Universe project.
So I like your notes there, and I hope people are cool, especially considering you will not have to wait months or years for the next chapter.
If Dracula shows up in Dark Legion
I'm not
2,
even saying.
right?
I'm not even saying for sure. In fact, I kind of don't want to pay this off immediately because we already have our plans for Dark Legion 2 that don't involve much of we haven't talked about anything in this movie because you hadn't heard it yet.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not promising we're going to resolve any of this immediately, but it's coming, and it won't be like 5 years from now because we put out one of these episodes every month.
Well, and I was kind of planning on doing a Dracula movie in Phase 3 since we're kind of trading characters.
Yeah.
I was gonna.
I don't know if we said that on the air yet, but I guess we can say it now. That one of our plans for Phase 3 is that we are going to trade custody of a couple of the characters that we've been doing.
So Dylan will do a mummy movie
and a Frankenstein.
Maybe
movie. We have some. We'll figure that out.
There's a couple things that maybe will stay.
At the very least, I'm going to do the Mummy. You're going to do the Wolfman.
Yeah,
and you want to do a Dracula.
And I think you were going to do a creature from the Black
I might
Lagoon
do a creature.
sequel.
You mentioned you wanted to maybe do Phantom too.
Yes, I might do a Phantom too.
We have not figured out our Phase 3 yet, but that's one of the things we've decided is that we want to play around a little bit with trading who has control over certain characters' destinies for a little while. Anyway, do you have anything else you want to talk about for this, or have we been on for a bit?
I think like I said, I like everything that's here. I think we can just elevate it by, stitching together things a little more cleanly. But I think we can get to picture lock.
Okay. Well, here's our little summary of what's happened. Dracula, still a human.
Yes.
We've introduced some supporting characters around his life, most of whom are now dead.
Also, the Master mentions a sister.
The Master, I'm glad you caught that, because all previous references only refer to brothers.
Yeah.
And that important thing for that is we've mentioned that all of the other princes are dead.
Mm-hmm.
But no one has mentioned what the fate is of Dracula's sister, the Master's presumably only other surviving child.
Now, I'm curious, do you know who that is? Or
I do.
Okay. I didn't know if you just left it as a breadcrumb
I
that
do
we'd
know
fill in
who
later.
that. I mean, I know her name. I don't know
Okay.
much else about her.
Okay.
Like I know what character she's going to be kind of based on.
Well, I like also that this focuses on, we had, as we talked about in the fan expectations, people thinking this was going to be like volleying for power between multiple parties. And I kind of like that you kept it to one brother, because that leaves us, like you said, the other brothers are dead, but like then introducing the sister, there's like other claimants to the throne, maybe, or the vampire throne that we haven't dealt with yet, that we can deal with later.
The implication that I hope I clarify, I don't want to get too into it because it's just so clunky and it's happened so long ago, that I hope that the Master clarifies there is that over the course of a couple centuries, in order to strengthen his own vampire line, Dracula murdered most of his siblings.
Yes.
And then by extension, basically committed vampire genocide so that only his children would survive. But there is one more vampire bloodline, at least one, that we don't know anything about.
There was Ahul.
But he's dead. Now, therefore, all of anybody he turned since he was released from the Talbot facility in Werewolves of London, they're all gone now.
Yeah.
So any vampires that are left are now descended from Dracula's sister, and we don't know about any of them.
Mm-hmm.
I like
this.
I have some wacky ideas about what that might be, but you're also, if you're taking Dracula up, you might end up answering that question for me.
That's true. I mean, we'll have to figure out. So if you already know who Dracula's sister is, the question is, if I do Dracula 2, do I have to do who you've decided?
No, you can do your own thing. If you want to ask me, I'll tell you off the air, but you don't have to. You don't have to follow that, because
doing the Last Jedi to Rise of Skywalker, where I just disregard whatever your plans
I wanted to leave you some road to work with, right? Okay, we have now officially canonically introduced Adelaide Van Helsing, played by Micah Monroe.
Love that.
And she is an absolutely ruthless slash and burn monster hunter.
Yes.
Who will stop at nothing to kill Dracula before he becomes a vampire
for like
again.
Nick Morton.
Yeah. We've introduced Victoire, a character from his past, who I think is our first canonical witch in our story. Yeah. She's still around, played by Naomi Harris. And Dracula, at the end of the story, climbs back to the mountain, meets the man who made him a vampire, the Master, played by Charles Dance, and is cryptically told, basically, whether or not, however we want to interpret the reality of this scene, I'm not making you a vampire again. Everything is too late.
Mm-hmm.
You have already unlocked the door to death.
Yeah.
And now you got to look at it. Now you got to face it. And present it in a literal fashion, but we can, how to interpret it is to be determined by us later.
Mm-hmm.
I think that basically covers it.
Yeah, I think we can lock it in.
All right, hit it.
It's alive! In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
Okay, well, with our next episode, we are going to have another guest.
Yes.
We're going to have my friend Dom Griffin, aka YouTube's armchair auteur. He's one of my favorite film critics. He's based out of DC, writes for Baltimore Beat. I cannot yet announce what he's going to be pitching us. I think that's still yet to be determined when we record this episode. But we will be back in 2 weeks with that. And then after that, it starts our ramp up into the Dark Legion 2, which we're going to have to start writing very soon.
It's summer blockbuster season, baby. So here's what we're thinking that's going to look like as of now. We'll have the Dom episode. 2 weeks later, we are going to have a little throwback recap episode. So new listeners, you can get caught up on the entire Dark Legion story so far.
Yes, we're listening to we're talking at the end of this 2.5 hour episode. We're saying, hey, any new listeners? You don't have to listen to any of this, actually. You could have saved a lot of time.
But we also want to make that fun for you. There will be us kind of reflecting on what we've done so far, and we're about to tape that right now. Then we are going to tape an episode where we plan Dark Legion 2 live on air, but we will not be releasing it until after the Dark Legion 2 has been out. So you can experience that movie with no spoilers in its final form.
We polled the Discord about this, and the word is that the last year we did the episode where we planned the Dark Legion 1, with the intention of that being the episode, and then realizing that we just liked it too much and had to write the movie.
Yeah.
Thus beginning the ever increasing workload of our show. This time we will record it. It will exist, but we're not going to put it out until the movie, both parts of our imaginary film, are released as a podcast.
That way you get the big summer blockbuster feeling of getting the Dark Legion 2 delivered right to you, not knowing what's going to happen, but then you get a peek behind the curtain and hearing us figure out how we were going to do that in real time.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about that is it gives us like a month off after we do the big movie.
So it is blockbuster season. We hope you have enjoyed phase 2 so far. We have done everything but the big crossover. It's been a very unpredictable phase.
Sure has.
But I think we have added so much stuff that will give us so much stories to play with going forward. We haven't closed any doors. We have only opened new characters, new plot lines, new villains. We have more to play with in our dark universe than ever before.
Yeah, I'm almost terrified to think about how we're gonna like manage the Dark Legion too. We're gonna have to set some boundaries for ourselves and decide stuff like who are we not gonna use and what are we not gonna follow up on yet, because there's just too fucking much.
Some stuff is gonna have to be saved for phase 3. Some of it's gonna have to be saved for the big saga ending, the phase 3 saga ending. So thank you all. We are gonna record another fucking episode right now. So we're gonna take a little break. We will see you in 2 weeks for another guest episode. And until then,
stay afraid of the dark universe.